There is something quietly unsettling about a place that used to be full of people. A street where children once ran barefoot through the dust. A kitchen where someone boiled a kettle every single morning for 40 years. A bed where someone lay down and listened to the wind move through the gum trees, thinking tomorrow would come the same as every other day. And then it didn't. Across Australia, there are hundreds of towns like this, places that appeared on maps, that had names and post offices and schools and pubs and churches, places where people built lives and buried their dead and planted gardens they expected to tend for the rest of their days. And then, one by one, those people left. Some towns emptied slowly, person by person, year by year, until the last one quietly locked their door and drove away without looking back. Others emptied faster than anyone expected, in a matter of weeks or months, as though someone had pulled a thread and the whole fabric simply unraveled. And a few, a very quiet and very strange few, seem to have emptied almost overnight. Tonight, we are going to visit 10 of them. We are going to walk through the silence of their empty streets. We are going to stand in their roofless buildings and their overgrown churchyards. We are going to read the names on their headstones and imagine the faces behind them. There is no need to rush. The night is long and the wind is soft. And these stories have been waiting patiently for a very long time. Let yourself settle in. Let your breathing slow. These are the ghost towns of Australia, and this is what happened to them. Number 1, Farina, South Australia. The name itself is soft, Farina. Say it slowly and it sounds like something you might whisper, like the name of a quiet river or a prayer murmured before sleep. It sits in the far north of South Australia, in a place called the Outback Track, roughly 600 kilometres north of Adelaide. The landscape around it is flat and red and ancient, stretching in every direction until the earth meets the sky in a pale, hazy line that looks painted rather than real. When the sun goes down out there, the temperature drops quickly, and the stars come out in numbers that people who have only ever seen city skies can barely believe. Thousands of them, millions of them, scattered across the dark in patterns that have been read and named and navigated by for 60,000 years. Farina sits beneath those stars now, and it is almost completely silent. But it was not always silent. The town was established in 1878 during a period when the South Australian government was actively encouraging settlers to push further and further north into land that the colonists had decided was suitable for farming. The name came from the Latin word for flower, because the official hope was that the region would become a great wheat-growing district. The settlers came, they built, they planted. The wheat did not grow. The rainfall in that part of Australia is erratic and often insufficient, and what the government had described as agricultural land was, in the view of the land itself, nothing of the sort. The wheat that was planted withered. The crops that were sown did not produce what the settlers had hoped. But the people stayed. They adapted. They shifted from farming to grazing, and Farina became a service town along one of the most important stock routes in the country, a place where drovers rested and cattle were watered, and supplies were purchased for the long journeys north and south. For a time, it worked. At its peak, Farina had a population of around 600 people. It had a hotel, several of them actually, because the drovers were thirsty men and the journey was long. It had a bakery, which operated in an underground chamber dug into the earth to keep the bread cool in the ferocious summer heat. It had a post office, a butcher, a general store, a police station, and a school. It had a town. And then the railway came. Not to Farina exactly. Through it and past it, connecting the south to the north in a way that changed the logic of the stock route entirely. The drovers no longer needed to stop at Farina. The cattle could be loaded onto trains further south and transported without the weeks of dusty walking that had made places like Farina so essential. The economy shifted. The hotel trade dropped. The butcher found fewer customers. The school, which had been built for the children of a growing town, watched its enrollments fall year by year. The droughts came too, as they always do in that part of the world. Long, fierce, relentless droughts that baked the red earth and killed the remaining livestock and made the question of staying feel less and less like stubbornness and more like foolishness. By the 1930s, the town was struggling. By the 1940s, it was barely holding on. By the 1960s, the last permanent residents had gone. And Farina was left to the heat and the wind and the slow, patient work of time. What remains now is extraordinary. The stone buildings, built from the local red sandstone, have proven more durable than anyone expected. The bakery underground still exists, its vaulted ceiling intact, its walls still cool to the touch, even on days when the air above is hot enough to shimmer. The ruins of the hotel stand in a row along what used to be the main street, their window frames empty, their floors open to the sky, their walls lit gold and amber in the afternoon light. There is a cemetery, as there always is in places like this. The headstones lean at various angles, some cracked, some weather-smooth to the point where the names have begun to disappear. But many are still legible, and if you walk slowly through them and read what is written, you can build a picture of the lives that were lived here. a woman who came from Germany and died in 1894, a child who lived for only 3 days and is recorded only as infant son of, a man who arrived from England and spent 40 years in the dust before resting beneath it. Every autumn now, a group of volunteers comes to Farina to do something remarkable. They come to rebuild it, not to restore it to a functioning town, because that particular story ended long ago, but to stabilize the buildings, to clear the scrub, to maintain the cemetery, to make the place legible for the people who drive out along the outback track and stop their cars and walk through the silence, trying to understand what it means for a place to have been and then to simply not be anymore. There is a campsite near the ruins. On clear nights, which are most nights out there, people lie on their backs and watch the stars and listen to the wind moving through the empty doorways of the old stone buildings. It sounds like breathing, very slow, very gentle, in and out, like the town itself is still here somehow, still present, just resting. Number 2, Gwalia, Western Australia. If Farina died slowly, Gwalia died of surprise. It sits in the goldfields of Western Australia, about 250 kilometres north of Kalgoorlie, in country that is flat and dry and merciless in a very different way from the South Australian outback. The vegetation is sparse and low and grey-green, and the red dirt roads lead away in every direction toward a horizon that always seems slightly too far away. Gold was found here in 1896, and the rush that followed was fast and chaotic and enormously productive. Within a few years, a proper town had been established, and by the early 1900s, Gwalia was home to thousands of people working the Sons of Gwalia mine, which was one of the most productive gold mines in Western Australia. The mine had a manager. His name was Herbert Hoover. Yes, that Herbert Hoover. The man who would later become the 31st President of the United States spent 2 years in Gwalia at the very beginning of his career, managing the Sons of Gwalia mine with an efficiency and profitability that established his reputation as a mining engineer of genuine talent. He lived in a house that is still standing, a modest wooden building on a hill above the town site, with a wide veranda and small windows, and the particular quality of light that comes with afternoon sun on old timber. The town grew around the mine. It had a hotel, a general store, an assay office, a post office, workers' cottages in rows. It had a sense of permanence that many gold rush towns never quite achieved, a feeling that this one was going to last. It lasted until 1963. That was when the gold ran out. Not gradually, not in a slow decline that gave people time to adjust and plan and find other arrangements. The mine simply reached the point where extracting more gold cost more than the gold was worth, and the company that owned it made the decision to close. The closure was announced in November 1963. The last shift was worked, the equipment was shut down, and within weeks the population of Gwalia, which had numbered in the hundreds, simply evaporated. People packed their houses into their cars and drove away. They left behind what they couldn't take, and what they didn't bother with, and what had accumulated over decades of living in a place and simply became, in the end, too heavy to carry. What was left was a ghost town so complete and so immediate that it became one of the most studied examples of 20th century abandonment in Australia. The houses still had furniture in them, wardrobes still held clothes, kitchens still had pots on shelves. In some cottages, personal photographs remained on the walls, the faces in them looking out into rooms that had stood empty for decades. The hotel, called the Gwalia Hotel, was left more or less intact. Its bar still had bottles, its rooms still had beds. The register on the front desk still had the last entries, the last names of the last guests who checked in before everything ended. Time has been both kind and unkind to Gwalia. The isolation has protected it from the casual vandalism that destroys so many abandoned places. The dry air has preserved materials that would have rotted in a wetter climate. But the sun is ferocious, and the heat is relentless, and wood and tin and glass can only resist for so long. Today, the town site is managed as a heritage precinct. The Hoover House has been restored, the hotel has been stabilized, the workers' cottages have been documented, and in some cases preserved. But the most powerful thing about Gwalia is not any individual building or any specific object. It is the silence in which everything is held. When you stand in the main street and look along the row of empty buildings, the quiet is so complete that you can almost hear the town breathing beneath it, the creak of a board, the click of metal contracting in the cooling air, the faint movement of dust. Somewhere beneath all of it, 200 meters down in the dark, the mine shafts are still open, still going down, filled now with darkness and water and the memory of the work that was done there. Nobody will be going back. Number 3, Wittenoom, Western Australia. This one is different. The others on this list are sad in the way that all abandoned places are sad. They carry the weight of lives lived and ended and left behind. But Wittenoom carries something else as well, something heavier. It sits in the Pilbara region of Western Australia, in a gorge country of extraordinary beauty, red rock walls rising hundreds of meters on either side of narrow valleys, through which small streams run clear and cold. The colors in that landscape are extraordinary, layered in bands of ochre and rust and violet, lit differently at every hour of the day. The town was established in the late 1930s to house the workers at a blue asbestos mine. Blue asbestos, also known as crocodylite, is the most dangerous form of asbestos and was used extensively in industrial applications throughout the mid-20th century before the full scale of its lethality was understood. At its peak in the 1950s, Wittenoom had a population of around 2,000 people. It had everything a town needs: schools and shops and a hospital and sporting facilities, and all the ordinary infrastructure of daily life. The people who lived there worked in the mine and the mill and raised their children and played cricket on weekends and watched films in the picture theatre on Saturday nights. The asbestos fibres were everywhere. They were in the air of the mine, in the air of the mill, in the blue dust that blew through the town on windy days, settling on everything, finding its way into lungs that were never designed to deal with it. Children played in the blue tailings that had been spread around the town as gravel. Families walked on paths edged with the substance that would, decades later, begin to kill them. The mine closed in 1966, when it became economically unviable. The town didn't empty immediately. People stayed for years, running businesses, raising families, living what felt like ordinary lives in a place that was, as was becoming increasingly clear, profoundly dangerous. The Western Australian government began to advise people to leave in the 1970s. The health statistics were becoming impossible to ignore. Mesothelioma, a cancer caused almost exclusively by asbestos exposure, was appearing in Wittenoom residents and former residents at rates that shocked the medical community. Not just the miners and mill workers, but their wives, their children, people who had never set foot in the mine but had simply lived in a town where the fibres were in the air. The government degazetted the town in 1993, officially removing it from maps and cutting off its utilities. This was not a decision made lightly. It was made because the government believed, and the science supported, that the asbestos contamination was so pervasive that no amount of remediation could make the site safe. Some residents refused to leave. This is the part of the Wittenoom story that is both heartbreaking and strange. Even after the degazettement, even after the utilities were cut, even after the roads were officially closed and the place was taken off the maps, a small number of people remained. Some were elderly and simply did not want to be uprooted. Some were attached to the landscape, the gorges, the extraordinary red country that surrounded them in a way that felt stronger than the fear of what the air might contain. The last few residents were still there in the early 2000s. The last one, a woman named Lorraine Thomas, left in 2007. The town itself is still there, more or less. The buildings have not been demolished. The streets are still visible. The trees planted in suburban gardens have grown enormous, untended, their roots lifting pathways and their branches reaching over rooflines. But the asbestos is still there too. The fibres are in the soil, they are in the ruins, they blow on windy days in concentrations that health authorities consider dangerous. The gorges nearby, which are some of the most beautiful natural landscapes in Western Australia, are open to visitors who take appropriate precautions. But the town itself is fenced and signed and warned about, a place you can look at from a distance but not safely linger in. Wittenoom is a ghost town with a reason that no one disputes. But the weight of it, the weight of all those people who breathe that air because nobody told them what it contained, the children who played in the blue dust, the families who trusted the company and the government and the ordinary assumptions of daily life. That weight sits in the silence of those empty streets as heavily as anything can sit. Number 4. Yerranderie, New South Wales. Come down from the heat now. Come down from the red north and the goldfields and the poisoned gorges, and follow the road south into New South Wales, into the ranges west of Sydney, into country that is green and steep and folded in on itself, where the valleys are deep and the ridges are sharp and the mist collects in the mornings and takes a long time to clear. Yerranderie sits in this country, about 150 kilometres southwest of Sydney, within what is now the Greater Blue Mountains World Heritage Area. It clings to a ridge above a valley so steep that the road into it was, for most of the town's history, barely passable. The town was built for silver mining. The ore was found in the 1890s, and the rush that followed brought people scrambling into the ranges along tracks that were rough and difficult and, in wet weather, nearly impassable. By the early 1900s, a proper town had been established, with hotels and a school and a church and all the various support businesses that a mining community generates. The silver was good while it lasted, and the community that formed around it was real and close and self-sufficient in the way that remote communities tend to be, because they have to be. The distance from Sydney meant that Yerranderie existed largely in its own world, with its own rhythms and its own social life and its own particular relationship with the mountain landscape that surrounded it. The silver began to run out in the 1920s. The Great Depression of the 1930s delivered a further blow, By the early 1940s, the mines were no longer viable, and the families that had built lives in the ranges were faced with the choice that remote communities always face when the economic reason for their existence disappears. They left, slowly at first and then more quickly, until by the mid-1940s the last of the residents had gone, and Yerranderie was left to the ranges. What makes Yerranderie unusual is that it came back, not as a living town, but as a managed heritage site, and then as a private property, and eventually as a place people could visit and even stay in. The descendants of one of the town's original families, the Payten family, I'd acquired the town site and have maintained it for decades with a commitment that is rare and impressive. Some of the old buildings have been restored and are available as self-contained accommodation. The church, which is the oldest surviving building in the area, has been stabilized. The hotel facade still stands, and there is the cemetery, as there always is. The Yerranderie Cemetery sits on a slight rise above the town, behind a fence that has been maintained through the years. The headstones record the names of the people who came to the ranges for silver and stayed for whatever reasons until the end. Many of the markers are simple, wood or plain stone, and the inscriptions have weathered to the point of illegibility, but the place is cared for. The grass is cut, the fence is repaired when it falls. Someone remembers. That is what makes Yerranderie different from many of the places on this list. It has not been entirely abandoned to time. There are still people who feel a connection to it, who tend to it, who come back to it. The mist still collects in the valley each morning. The ridges are still sharp against the sky. The birds are very loud here and very varied, and the forest that grew back after the mining is old enough now to have its own kind of grandeur. At night, with no light pollution for 100 kilometers in any direction, the stars are extraordinary. The old hotel creaks in the mountain wind. The church holds its silence, the cemetery keeps its names, and the ranges go on and on and on, indifferent and ancient and beautiful, the way ranges always are. Number 5. Walhalla, Victoria. There are ghost towns that feel abandoned, and then there is Walhalla, which feels merely asleep. It sits in the mountains of Gippsland in eastern Victoria, in a valley so narrow and so steep that the town had to be built vertically, climbing the hillsides in terraces connected by paths rather than roads, because roads wide enough for vehicles were simply not possible in most places. The buildings cling to the slopes like something grown rather than constructed. The cemetery, which is extraordinary, is carved into the hillside in horizontal rows, each row accessible by a narrow path, the graves looking down into the valley from different levels like the audience in a theatre. Gold was found at Walhalla in 1863, and the rush that followed was so intense that within a few years, the valley held a town of almost 4,000 people. It had a post office, a newspaper, several hotels, a mechanics institute, and a tramway that was used to move ore and supplies up and down the steep gradients. The gold lasted longer here than in many places. The mines at Walhalla, particularly the Long Tunnel mine, produced gold continuously for decades. By the late 19th century, the town had a genuine sense of permanence and prosperity. The gold ended in 1914, not all at once, but the last major mine, the Long Tunnel Extended, closed that year, and the population began to decline with a speed that surprised everyone. Within a decade, thousands of people had left. Within a few more decades, only a handful of residents remained. What was left behind, in the narrow valley and on the steep hillsides, was a town that had not been demolished or burned or deliberately cleared. It had simply been left, and because it was in a steep, remote valley with no particular reason for casual visits, it was left largely undisturbed for decades. The buildings weathered, the trees grew back. The creek that ran through the valley, which had once been dammed and diverted in service of the mining, resumed something like its natural course. And then, slowly, people started to come back, not to live, but to see. Today, Walhalla is classified as a ghost town, but it is one with a small permanent population, a very small one, and a significant number of tourists who make the winding mountain drive to walk its paths and visit its cemetery, and descend into the Long Tunnel mine on the guided tours that have been operating for decades. The cemetery is the heart of the place, in the way that cemeteries often are in old Australian towns. It is one of the most striking cemeteries in Victoria, perhaps in the country. The graves are arranged in terraces on the steep hillside, each row slightly higher than the one below, the headstones facing outward toward the valley. Some of the graves date from the 1860s, the earliest years of the gold rush. Some are of miners killed in underground accidents, their names and ages, and the brief facts of their deaths recorded in stone. There are children's graves, as there always were in 19th century cemeteries. Small graves, some of them very small, marked with tablets that record names and ages in months or weeks or days. The forest has grown dense around the cemetery. In the mornings, when the mist is in the valley, the headstones emerge from the fog in a way that is both beautiful and otherworldly, the names appearing and disappearing as the air moves. Walhalla feels, more than almost any other place on this list, like a town that is waiting, not for the gold to return, not for the mines to reopen, but for something, for the story to make sense, for the reason to become clear. The creek still runs, the birds still fill the mornings with sound. The steep paths still connect the levels of the town, and if you walk them slowly and let your eyes move over the old buildings and the overgrown gardens and the stone walls that someone built with enormous care 150 years ago, you can feel the presence of the place pressing back against you. It is not hostile. It is simply full of time and weather, and the accumulated weight of all the days that have passed in the narrow valley since the first miners arrived with their picks and their hopes and their absolute certainty that the gold would last. Number 6, Silverton, New South Wales. Some ghost towns are famous. Silverton is famous for being famous without quite being a ghost town, which is its particular distinction. It sits on the western slopes of the Barrier Range in far western New South Wales, about 25 kilometres north of Broken Hill, in country that is flat and red and windswept and enormous. The sky out there is bigger than skies usually are, or at least it feels that way, because the land is so flat and so open that the horizon circles you at the full extent of vision in every direction. Silver was found in the Barrier Ranges in the early 1880s, and Silverton came into existence quickly and noisily, in the way that silver boomtowns always did. By the mid-1880s, it had a population of around 3,000 people and all the institutions that a town of that size requires. But the real silver, the mother lode, turned out to be not in Silverton but nearby, at a place called Broken Hill. And when that became clear, the miners and the merchants and the hotel keepers and everyone else who had established themselves in Silverton began the steady migration south to where the real money was. By the early 1890s, Silverton's population had dropped dramatically. By the turn of the century, it was a very small town indeed. By the mid-20th century, it had perhaps 100 residents. And for a time, it seemed as though it might follow the path of complete abandonment that so many similar towns had taken. It didn't. It survived. And it survived in a way that is both unusual and, in its own way, rather wonderful. Silverton became a place that filmmakers loved. The landscape around it, red and flat and ancient and enormous, with the occasional jagged ridge of rock and the wide sky and the particular quality of light that you only get in outback New South Wales, was exactly what certain films needed. Mad Max 2 was filmed nearby, using Silverton's landscape as the post-apocalyptic world that the film required. A town like Alice used it. Razorback used it. Numerous commercials and television productions have been filmed in and around Silverton over the decades. This has given the town a strange kind of life. There is still a hotel, the Silverton Hotel, which has been operating continuously since the 1880s and is one of the great outback pubs of Australia. The walls are covered in photographs and memorabilia, and the beer is cold, and on the veranda in the late afternoon, you can watch the light change over the red plains in a way that is difficult to describe to people who haven't seen it. There is a small population of artists who have moved to Silverton over the decades, drawn by the light and the silence and the strangeness of a place that exists in a kind of suspended state between past and present. There are ruins, the old jail, the school, long closed, various stone buildings that were put up during the Silver Rush and have been standing in varying degrees of completeness ever since. And there is the sense, walking through Silverton on a weekday morning when the tourists haven't yet arrived, that you're in a place that has somehow slipped sideways in time, that the silver miners are not entirely gone, that the school bell might ring, that the horses tied up outside the hotel might be real. The wind helps with this feeling. It is almost always windy in Silverton, a warm, dry wind from the west that moves the dust and rattles the corrugated iron and fills the spaces between buildings with a low, continuous sound. It is the sound of a place that is still here, against all reasonable expectation, still holding on. Number 7, Kiandra, New South Wales. Let's go up into the mountains now, into the high country of New South Wales, into the snowy mountains, where the air is thin and cold, and in winter the snow comes deep and stays for months. Kiandra sits on the high plains at about 1,400 metres above sea level, which by Australian standards is genuinely high country. The climate is harsh, short summers, long winters, frost possible in any month, snowfall reliable and heavy from June to September. Gold was found at Kiandra in 1859. And what followed was one of the most remarkable episodes in Australian gold rush history. Within weeks of the discovery, thousands of miners were scrambling up into the mountains, many of them from the Victorian goldfields, many arriving in the middle of winter when the conditions were brutal and the snow was already on the ground. They came anyway, thousands of them in the snow, in the cold, following the rumour of gold into the mountains. By mid-1860, Kiandra had a population of somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people, making it one of the largest towns in New South Wales at the time. Hotels, theatres, stores, banks, a post office, a hospital, a racecourse. All of these appeared in the mountains with extraordinary speed. as though someone had picked up a city from the coast and set it down in the snow. The gold ran out relatively quickly. By 1861, the easily accessible alluvial gold was largely gone. The population dropped as fast as it had risen. Within a few years, Kiandra was a fraction of its peak size, and it continued to shrink through the following decades as mining became less viable and the harshness of the climate made farming difficult. But Kiandra left behind one very specific legacy. The miners who came to Kiandra in the 1860s included a significant number of Norwegians, who had come to Australia for the gold rush and brought with them a piece of recreational technology that was entirely unknown in the Australian mountains: skis. They skied. In the mountains above Kiandra, Norwegian miners made skis from timber and attached them to their boots and slid down the snowfields for recreation, organising races and competitions that are now recorded as the first skiing in Australia. The Kiandra Ski Club, founded in 1861, is one of the oldest ski clubs in the world. This small fact sits in the ruins of Kiandra like a jewel in the dust, something entirely unexpected. A connection between the Norwegian mountains and the Australian high country that nobody anticipated and nobody planned. The town eventually declined to nothing. What remains today are a few stone chimneys, some building foundations, the traces of streets, and the cemetery, which is, as always, the most enduring part. The high plains around the old town site are beautiful in every season. In winter, snow covers everything, and the ruins disappear under white. In summer, the snowgrass and alpine flowers bloom across the slopes, and the air is clear and cold and the sky is very blue. And if you stand very still, you can sometimes hear, on the right kind of day, the silence of a place that was once enormously full of sound. The Norwegians went home, most of them, or moved on to other goldfields. The mining companies came and went. The hotels and the theatres and the bank fell down one wall at a time. But the skiing stayed. It's still there. In the resorts down the road, in the lift lines and the groomed runs, and the lodges full of people from the cities. It came from Kiandra, from men in heavy coats sliding down a snowfield in 1861, laughing probably, because skiing is the kind of thing that makes people laugh. Number 8, Ravenswood, Queensland. Some towns refuse to give up. Ravenswood sits about 120 kilometres south of Townsville in northern Queensland, in dry savanna country where the grass is tall and golden in the dry season, and the heat is substantial for most of the year. It is not comfortable country, particularly in summer, but it has a particular beauty, wide and open and lit with a clarity that you get in the tropics, where the colours are saturated and the shadows are very sharp. Gold was found here in 1868, and the town that grew around the gold was, at its peak, a genuinely significant settlement. By the 1870s and 1880s, Ravenswood had several thousand residents and the full complement of buildings that this required. It had hotels and churches and a courthouse and a school and a hospital and all the infrastructure of 19th century Queensland town life. And then the gold ran down, as it always does, and the population fell, and the question became not whether Ravenswood would empty, but how quickly. Slowly is the answer. Ravenswood emptied very slowly. This is because the gold, while no longer spectacularly abundant, was never quite gone. There was always a little, always enough to justify one more attempt, one more company, one more round of investment. Through the 20th century, the population fluctuated but never reached zero. There were always a few hundred people in Ravenswood, running the pubs and the school and the post office, and waiting for the gold to come back in strength. It did in a way. Modern mining techniques, particularly the open-cut methods developed in the 20th century and the heap leach gold extraction processes refined in the 1980s and 1990s, made it economically viable to process ore that the 19th century miners had left behind as unprofitable. A modern mining operation reopened in Ravenswood in the late 20th century, and the town that had been slowly emptying for 100 years received a modest influx of new residents. But the ghost town quality of Ravenswood persists, because alongside the modern mining activity and the working pub and the small current population, the historic buildings are still there. The 19th century hotels with their wide verandas and their ironwork decorations. The courthouse, the school, the bank. Some of these buildings are in active use. Some are maintained as heritage structures. Some are slowly returning to the earth. Walking through Ravenswood is a particular experience because you are in two time periods simultaneously. The past is not behind you, not tucked away in a museum or hidden in a heritage precinct. It is right beside you, immediately present, in the buildings and the streets and the landscape. The tree that someone planted outside the old hotel in 1880 is now enormous and provides shade to the veranda just as it always did. The courthouse that handled the disputes and crimes and legal affairs of a gold rush town in the 1870s still stands, its stone walls intact, its windows looking out over a street that is quieter now than it has ever been. The cemetery records names from the 1870s and the 1880s and the 1890s, and all the decades between then and now, a continuous record of lives lived in the same difficult, beautiful country. Ravenswood is a ghost town that never quite became one. It is still there, still working, still stubbornly, quietly present. Number 9, Cossack, Western Australia. There is a different kind of silence in coastal places. It is the silence not of dry air and dust, but of salt and tide, and the particular emptiness that exists in a place where the sea comes close. The wind comes off the water and moves through the ruins with a sound that is different from inland wind, heavier somehow, more present. Cossack sits on the northwest coast of Western Australia, near the mouth of the Harding River, in the Pilbara region. It is a place of red cliffs and turquoise water, and the particular harsh beauty of the northwest, where the tides are large and the cyclones come regularly, and the land and the sea are both indifferent and majestic. The town was established in the 1860s as a supply port for the pastoral stations of the northwest interior, and it grew steadily through the following decades as the pearling industry developed in the waters of the northwest coast. Pearling was the industry that defined Cossack and the surrounding coast in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The shallow waters of the northwest were rich with pearl oysters, and the industry that extracted them was large and profitable and deeply uncomfortable in its human dimensions, involving as it did the exploitation and often the enslavement of Aboriginal and Islander workers, who were the backbone of the diving operations. At its peak, Cossack was the most important port in the northwest. Ships came and went. The pearling luggers went out to the shell beds and came back heavy. The merchants and the pearling masters and the government officials and the various support industries all clustered in the town around the harbour. It had stone buildings, which is remarkable in a region where most construction was timber and corrugated iron. The buildings were constructed from local stone by craftsmen of real skill, and they stand today as a testament to the confidence that the people of the time had in the town's permanence. That confidence turned out to be misplaced. The pearling industry began to decline. The harbour silted up, making it increasingly difficult for larger vessels to use. A new port was built at Roebourne, better positioned and easier to maintain. The railway came to Roebourne and not to Cossack. The commercial logic that had built the town simply shifted away, and Cossack was left behind. By the early 20th century, the town was largely empty. By the 1950s, only a caretaker remained. What remains today is something remarkable. The stone buildings have proven extraordinarily durable. The courthouse, which dates from 1896, is still standing with walls intact. The stone warehouses along the waterfront are still recognizable as the places they were built to be. The cemetery, as always, holds the names. The cemetery at Cossack is particularly moving because it records the deaths of the pearling industry in its most human form. There are graves of Japanese and Malay and Filipino and Aboriginal divers, men who came from across the region to work in the pearl grounds, and who died from the bends, from cyclones, from shark attacks, from the 100 ways the sea has of killing people who work in it. The names on the stones are from everywhere. They came from Japan and the Philippines and the islands of the Pacific and the Aboriginal communities of the northwest coast, and they ended here, in this red earth cemetery on the edge of the continent, within sound of the tides that killed them. At night, the lighthouse at the end of the point still flashes. Not because ships need it anymore, because it has been maintained, because someone decided that it should continue to flash even after the ship stopped coming, even after the harbour silted up, even after the last pearl lugger left and the last merchant closed his store and the town became what it is now. A light still flashing over empty water. It is one of the lonelier things in Western Australia, and Western Australia has a great many lonely things. Number 10, Newnes, New South Wales, the last one. Save this one for the end of the night, for the quiet that comes after midnight, when the house is still and the world is very dark outside and you're almost asleep. Newnes sits in the Walgan Valley in the Blue Mountains west of Sydney, in a deep valley enclosed by sandstone cliffs and dense eucalyptus forest. The approach to it is down a road that winds along the edge of a gorge, and on a day when the mist is in the valley, you descend into something that feels less like a road and more like a passage. The town was built for shale oil. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, oil shale was extracted from the cliffs of the Walgan Valley and processed in a retort works that operated from 1906 to 1932. At its peak, Newnes was a genuine industrial town, with a population of several hundred workers and their families, a hotel, a school, a post office, and a railway that wound through the mountains to connect the valley to the rest of the state. The shale oil industry struggled throughout its history. The quality of the oil was good, but the cost of extraction and processing in such a remote and difficult location was enormous, and when cheaper oil became available from other sources, the economics of Newnes became impossible to sustain. The works closed in 1932. The workers left. The railway was eventually removed. The valley was left to its own devices. What grew back in the Walgan Valley after the people left is, in its own way, extraordinary. The forest reclaimed the cleared areas with a thoroughness that speaks to the resilience of Australian bush. The creek that had been dammed and redirected in service of the retort works gradually returned to something like its natural course. The wallabies and wombats and echidnas that had been displaced by the industrial activity moved back into the valley in numbers. Some things were left behind that time has transformed in unexpected ways. The old shale oil retorts are a particular case. The chemical processes that occurred inside them during the years of operation left residues that, over the following decades, created an environment in the old brickwork tunnels that is now home to one of the most remarkable populations of glowworms in New South Wales. Thousands of them covering the walls and ceilings of the old retort tunnels in a pale blue-green light that is luminous and otherworldly and deeply strange. Visitors to Newnes walk through the ruins and the forest, and eventually come to the old retort tunnels and duck inside, and they are in a different world. The glowworms pulse softly in the dark. The brickwork arches over them. The sound of the creek comes faintly from outside. It is beautiful in the way that only things that have transformed from one state to another can be beautiful. The industry is gone, the workers are gone, the noise and the heat and the oil and the steam are all gone. What is left is this quiet space in the sandstone, lit by thousands of tiny living lights, and the forest pressing in on every side. The hotel site is still visible, its footings in the earth. The school has left a trace, the railway cutting through the cliffs is still there, walkable now as a hiking trail that gives access to the valley from the plateau above. And the glowworms glow, every night, in the dark, in the old brick chambers where men once worked with heat and chemicals and the industrial logic of a century that is now over. Every night, without any audience at all, the glowworms light up the tunnels of Newnes, and the valley holds its breath, and the forest grows slowly denser, and the creek runs where it wants to run, and the sandstone cliffs stand above everything, as they have stood for 250 million years, waiting for whatever comes next. These are the ghost towns of Australia, 10 places that were full of people and are now, in various degrees, empty. 10 stories of gold found and exhausted, of silver and pearls and shale oil, and the brief, bright economies they created. 10 places where people built their lives and buried their dead and planted their gardens and expected to stay. They didn't stay. Or rather, they stayed as long as the reason for staying held. And when the gold ran out, or the silver ran down, or the harbour silted up, or the company folded, or the asbestos was found in the air, the logic of staying dissolved, and the people made the deeply human calculation that their lives were more important than their places. And they left. What remained was the places themselves, the buildings and the streets and the cemeteries and the gardens and the trees that had been planted, and the wells that had been dug, and the fences that had been put up, and the paths that had been worn smooth by the feet of people who no longer walked them. Time does something to all of these things. It softens some of them. The sharp edges of the stone buildings round and weather. The gardens go wild and then revert, through a long process of succession, to something like bush. The streets fill with blown seed and dust, and eventually with plants whose roots crack the surface and pull it back toward the soil from which it came. Time makes other things harder. The personal objects left behind, the photographs on walls, the cups on shelves, the clothes in wardrobes, accumulate a kind of pathos that deepens rather than fades. The fact of a specific life, lived in a specific place, leaves residues that don't dissolve quickly. And the cemeteries. The cemeteries are always the most enduring part of these places, and perhaps that is as it should be. They were built with the explicit intention of lasting. The headstones were chosen for durability. The enclosures were built to resist. The inscriptions were cut deep enough to survive decades of weather. They last because they were meant to last. Because the people who built them understood that the dead need to be findable, that the names need to persist, that the fact of a life, however brief, however ordinary, however unremarkable to everyone except the people who loved it, is worth recording in stone. So the cemeteries outlast the towns that built them. The names outlast the streets. The dead are more durable than the living, or at least their markers are. This is both unsettling and, if you think about it, rather comforting. The names are still there, the towns are still findable on the map, or just off it, or in the places where maps have not yet caught up with what time has done. The stories are still tellable. We told them tonight, the wind is quieter now. The night has moved past its deepest point and is beginning, almost imperceptibly, to lighten at its edges. The ghost towns of Australia are out there in the dark, Farina under its enormous stars, Gwalia with its empty hotel, Wittenoom with its silent streets and its invisible danger, Yerranderie in its mountain ranges, Walhalla in its narrow valley, Silverton on its red plains, Kiandra under its snow, Ravenswood with its stubborn remaining life, Cossack by its silted harbour, Newnes in its valley of glowworms. They are all out there. They will be there in the morning. They will be there long after all of us have gone, wherever it is we go. The stone is patient, the earth is patient, the silence is patient. Let it hold you now. Let the weight of all those years rest gently on you, soft as the dust on the floor of an empty room, warm as the late afternoon light through an empty window. You can let go. The stories are told. The names are remembered. The places are still there, in the dark, under their different skies, doing what places do when people leave them, being, just being. And that is enough. That is, in the end, quite enough. Good night. Extended meditations, returning to each town before dawn. There is a practice among certain kinds of travelers, the ones who visit old places not for photographs or checklists, but for something harder to name, of returning, of coming back to a place a second time when the tourist impulse has been satisfied and something quieter can begin. We're going to do that now. The night is still. Your breathing has slowed. Let's go back through these 10 places more slowly, in more detail. The way you revisit a half-remembered dream when you're lying in the quiet dark, and the house is still and the world outside has gone down to its lowest volume. Let's start again at the beginning. Returning to Farina. There is a particular hour in the outback that is neither night nor day, a period between roughly 4 and 5 in the morning when the darkness has not yet begun to lift, but the absolute blackness of the deep night has softened slightly, and the stars are still fully present above, and the temperature is at its lowest, and the world is in a state of suspension. In Farina, at that hour, the stone ruins glow faintly in the starlight. Not literally, not with any light of their own, but with the particular quality of pale sandstone in the darkness, which has a luminosity that is different from the darkness around it, as though the stone has stored something of the previous day's light and is returning it very slowly. The main street of Farina runs roughly north to south. It was never a very long street, perhaps 200 meters from one end to the other, but in the context of the country around it, it was a street, which is to say it was a human thing in an inhuman landscape, a marker of intention and effort. The buildings along it were never grand. They were functional buildings made of whatever was available, which in this case was the local pink sandstone, which was close to the surface and could be cut in usable blocks without enormous difficulty. The stonemasons who worked here in the 1870s and 1880s were competent rather than inspired. And the buildings they made reflect that. They are solid and sensible and entirely appropriate for what they were. What they were was a hotel, a store, a bakery, a residence or two, a small collection of structures that together constituted the commercial center of a town that existed to serve the needs of people moving through. The hotel is the largest ruin, and in the early morning it has a particular quality. The walls still stand to a height of 2 or 3 meters in most places, though the roof and floors are long gone. You can walk through the doorway, which is still framed by its original stone arch, and stand in what was once the main room of the hotel, open to the sky, the stars directly above you, the walls on 4 sides defining a space that still feels like a room even though it is no longer enclosed. People drank here. They sat at a bar that no longer exists and drank beer that had been carried hundreds of kilometers by bullock wagon and warm from the journey. And they talked about the road ahead or the one behind, about the stock they were moving and the rains that had or hadn't come and the prices in Adelaide. They were ordinary conversations, the conversations that all people have in all times and all places, the small talk of daily life, the exchange of information and opinion and complaint that constitutes the social fabric of human communities. And then the conversations ended. The hotel emptied. The drovers took a different route or no route at all because the railway had changed the logic of everything and the need for places like Farina dissolved. But the stone stayed. Stone is patient in a way that wood and metal and glass are not. It does not burn or rust or rot. It is simply compressed time, millions of years of accumulated mineral pressure, rendered into material that resists the forces acting on it with an indifference that borders on contempt. The stonemasons who cut these blocks and set them in these walls did not know that their work would outlast their town. They were building a hotel, not a monument. They were doing a practical job for practical pay, and the permanence of the material they used was incidental to their purposes. But here the walls stand, 150 years later, under the outback stars. In the suspension of the pre-dawn, the bakery is underground, which is why it has survived even better than the hotel. The bakers who designed and built it understood the climate perfectly. Above ground, in a corrugated iron building, the summer heat would make baking impossible during the long hot days. Below ground, in a chamber dug into the red earth and roofed with a stone vault, the temperature remained bearable even in the worst of the summer. You can go down into it now if you visit Farina at the right time of year when the conservation volunteers have unlocked it. The entrance is a rough stairway cut into the earth, and you duck below the surface and find yourself in a space that is still cool, still slightly damp, still smelling of earth and stone, and the very faint ghost of something that might once have been yeast. The vault overhead is low, the walls are close. In a working bakery, this room would have been full of heat and noise, of the thumping of dough, and the voice of the baker, and the smell of bread in various stages of becoming bread. Now it is very quiet. The earth above it carries the weight of the years since the baker left. The town above is silent, the country around the town is silent. The stars above the country are doing what stars do, which is move very slowly in their ancient patterns, indifferent to everything beneath them. In the vault, in the early morning, the silence is perfect. Think about what bread means for a moment, here in the dark of the underground bakery. Bread is one of the oldest human things. The combination of grain and water and heat, the cultivation of wild yeast, the practice of fermentation, is something that human beings have been doing for at least 14,000 years, possibly longer. Every civilization that has worked with grain has made some version of bread. And the practice has moved with people across continents and across centuries, adapting to local ingredients and local conditions, but remaining in its essentials the same ancient thing. The baker in Farina, who built this underground chamber and mixed his dough and stoked his fire every morning, was doing something that connected him, whether he knew it or not, to every baker who had ever worked in every place in the world. The bread he made fed the drovers who rested in the town before continuing north. The drovers ate the bread and continued their journeys, and the bread became the energy that moved cattle across a continent. And now the oven is cold, and the dough is long gone, and the chamber is empty, and the town above is ruins, and the drovers are a century in the past, but the stone vault is still here. Curving over the empty space, holding the quiet, keeping the cool, it endures, as stone always does. Returning to Gwalia. The workers' cottages of Gwalia were built to a standard pattern, which is to say they were all the same. This was deliberate. The company that owned the Sons of Gwalia mine was efficient in its calculations, and building identical cottages for its workers was more economical than building varied ones. So the rows of cottages that lined the streets of Gwalia were identical in plan and near identical in construction. 2 or 3 rooms, a small veranda, a corrugated iron roof, weatherboard walls, a small yard. Inside, the families that occupied them made them different. They hung different curtains. They put different linoleum on the different floors. They kept their particular collections of things. The accumulated objects of a life, ornaments and photographs and tools and books and the small domestic equipment of cooking and cleaning and sewing and repairing, and all the other activities that constitute being alive in a house. When the mine closed in November 1963 and the people left, most of the larger and more valuable objects went with them. The furniture went in the vans, the photographs came off the walls, the good china was wrapped in newspaper and packed in boxes, but not everything. Not the things that seemed in the rush and the confusion and the weight of leaving, too heavy or too bulky or too worn to be worth taking. Not the things that were so ordinary they were invisible until they were left behind and became, by the fact of their remaining, extraordinary. A chair in a corner, a cup on a shelf. A calendar on a wall showing November 1963, the month everything ended. These things are the texture of Gwalia's ghost town quality. Not the big story, not the mine closing and the town emptying, but the small residue of ordinary lives that couldn't entirely be packed up and taken away. Time has worked on these objects in the decades since the leaving. The dry climate of the Western Australian goldfields has been, in one sense, kind. The absence of humidity has prevented much of the rot and mold that would have destroyed these things in a wetter environment. But the heat has been harsh and the ultraviolet light of the goldfield sun is intense, and the materials of ordinary domestic life were never designed for decades of abandonment. The fabric things, the curtains and the clothing, and the bedding that was left in wardrobes have suffered the most. The colors have bleached, the fibers have weakened. In some cases, what was once a dress or a shirt or a pair of curtains has become something more like a sketch of a textile, present more in memory than in substance. The paper things, the calendars and the labels and the newspapers used to wrap things have faded to illegibility in many cases, or have become fragile beyond handling. But the images on them, when they can still be seen, carry a quality that is difficult to describe. The faces in a photograph, the typeface of a 1963 advertisement, the black and white image of a product that no longer exists. They look out from their faded surfaces with the particular expression of the unknowingly photographed, caught in a moment they had no idea would be the moment. A fraction of a second extracted from the flow of time and held, imperfectly but permanently, in silver halide on paper. The Gwalia hotel register is different from the domestic objects because it was a record rather than a possession. It was meant to last, or at least to last until the next register was needed, which in a functioning hotel would have been a year or 2. The fact that it lasted much longer than that is an accident of closure. The last entries are in the handwriting of whoever was working the desk in November 1963. Names, dates, room numbers. The ordinary administrative record of people coming and going, captured in ink on ruled paper, never expecting to become what it became. The last entry in a record that would not be continued. After those last entries, there are blank pages, many of them. Are ruled and waiting for the next names, which never came. The blank pages of the Gwalia Hotel Register are, in their own way, as powerful as the written ones. They are the space after the end. There is something specifically 1963 about Gwalia's particular ghost town atmosphere, and it is worth sitting with that for a moment. The families who left in November 1963 were people of the mid-20th century. They listened to the radio, they watched television if they had one. The children went to school and learned the things that children in 1963 learned. The adults voted in elections and paid their taxes and worried about the same things that people everywhere worried about in 1963. They were not frontier people. They were not pioneering settlers in the 19th century sense. They were ordinary Australians of the post-war period, living in a company town in the goldfields. And when the company decided the gold was done, they packed their lives into whatever transport they had and drove away down the red dirt roads toward Kalgoorlie and Coolgardie and Perth and the ordinary world. They became ordinary again, most of them. They found other work and other houses, and the children grew up and the years passed. The specific reality of Gwalia faded into a particular kind of memory, the memory of a place that was where you were before. But the town they left was preserved almost accidentally by its isolation and its dry climate, and it became something that none of them could have anticipated, an artifact of their own ordinary lives, preserved in situ like a fly in amber, requiring no reconstruction because there was nothing to reconstruct. The 1963 that they left behind is still there. Every year it gets a little older. Returning to Wittenoom, the gorges are still beautiful. This is important to say. The gorges around Wittenoom, the Wittenoom Gorge, and the Vampire Gorge, and the Joffrey Gorge and the others, are among the most beautiful landscapes in Western Australia. And Western Australia has landscapes that are among the most beautiful in the world. The rock is ancient. It is Precambrian banded iron formation, laid down in the shallow seas of an Earth that was more than 2 billion years old, when the atmosphere was different and the oceans were different, and life on the planet was still confined to single cells doing their slow and invisible work. Over the billions of years since then, the rock has been folded and tilted and weathered. And what remains is a landscape of extraordinary geological drama. Red and black and grey bands of rock rising in walls hundreds of meters high, folded into curves that look impossible, catching the light at every angle differently. The creek that runs through Wittenoom Gorge is, in the wet season, a proper creek with pools deep enough to swim in and water clear enough to drink. Flowers bloom along its banks. Figs and paperbarks and various other species of the northwest have established themselves in the narrow strip of moisture that the creek provides, and in the dry season they persist, a green thread winding through the red country. It is objectively beautiful, and it is dangerous, depending on how the wind is blowing and what the current fiber count in the air happens to be. This is the particular tragedy of Wittenoom, that the beauty and the danger are in the same place, inseparable, the same gorge, the same red walls, the same creek. The asbestos that was mined here and processed here is in the tailings that were spread around the town site. It is in the soil of the residential areas. It is, on windy days, in the air. The fibers are not visible. They are not smellable. You cannot tell, standing in the wind in Wittenoom, whether you are inhaling something that will, 20 or 40 years from now, begin the cellular changes that lead to mesothelioma. The people who lived here in the 1940s and 1950s breathed without any awareness of this. They breathed the blue dust in the mine, and the processed fibers around the mill, and the contaminated air of the town, because nobody had told them not to. Because the company that owned the mine knew, or suspected, what the fibers could do, but the financial logic of production overrode whatever concern existed, and the workers were not warned. This is the part of the Wittenoom story that is not quiet or gentle. It is the part that is angry, with the specific anger that arises from preventable harm. The people who died of mesothelioma from Wittenoom exposure, the hundreds of them, the many hundreds, could have been protected. The information existed. The decision was made not to act on it. The town that remains, silent in its contaminated valley, holds this history as clearly as it holds any other. But the gorges are still beautiful. The creek still runs. The ancient rock still catches the afternoon light in those extraordinary banded layers of red and black and grey. Beauty and danger. Inseparable. In the night, the stars above the Pilbara are very bright. The Milky Way runs across the sky in a band that is dense and brilliant, and the individual stars are sharp and clear in the dry air, and the gorge walls rise on either side into the darkness, and the silence is absolute except for the creek, which always makes a sound. It is the oldest sound, water over stone, running downhill, going where water always goes. Returning to Yerranderie. The mountains around Yerranderie are not particularly high by global standards. By Australian standards, they are very high indeed. Australia is, in geological terms, an old and tired continent, its mountains long since worn down from whatever heights they once achieved, its ranges modest and rounded and covered in the particular grey-green of eucalyptus forest. But modest and rounded is not the same as unimpressive. The Blue Mountains west of Sydney, of which the ranges around Yerranderie are a part, have a quality of scale that is not about height but about depth. The valleys are very deep. The cliffs drop straight into valleys that are filled with forest, and the forest is old, and the light in the afternoons is extraordinary. A combination of the eucalyptus oil in the air and the angle of the sun that creates a blue haze from which the mountains take their name. Yerranderie is at the end of a road that gets progressively narrower and more serious as you drive it. The last stretch is an unsealed track that winds along the edge of a ridge, with steep drops on one side and the forest pressing in on the other, and in wet weather it is genuinely difficult. At the clay surface turning slick and treacherous. Coming down off the ridge and into Yerranderie feels like arriving somewhere, in a way that more accessible places rarely do. The effort of the journey has been sufficient to create a sense of arrival, of having come somewhere that requires commitment. The town sits on a small flat area carved out of the steep country. Around it, the hillsides rise immediately, clothed in the grey-green of the forest, and the sky above is the narrow slice that steep country provides, a corridor rather than a dome. The church is the oldest survivor, and it sits on its slight rise above the town with the particular quality of old religious buildings in remote places, a quality of having witnessed things, not the specific events of the town's history, which are documented elsewhere, but the ordinary events of daily life, the Sunday services, and the marriages and the funerals and the baptisms, the repeated gathering of people in a specific place for the purposes of marking the significant events of their lives. Churches and ghost towns carry this weight very explicitly because their purpose was communal and their loss means the loss of the community. A hotel in a ghost town has lost its customers. A school has lost its students, but a church has lost its congregation, which is a more complete kind of loss, because the congregation was not just the customers of a service, but the community itself, gathered in the act of being a community. The Yerranderie church still has its bell. It is a small bell, not a large, impressive one. Yeah, just the practical bell that was needed to call people in from the surrounding properties on Sunday mornings. It is still mounted in its frame above the entrance, slightly tilted now, the rope that once hung from it long gone. If you rang it, the sound would carry across the valley in the morning air. The mountains would receive it and let it die in the forest, and there would be no response because there is no congregation to respond. But it would have sounded, and the sound would have been real, and that is something. Returning to Walhalla, the long tunnel mine goes down a very long way. This is not surprising given its name. The mine was worked for decades, and the tunnels driven into the mountain in pursuit of the gold-bearing reef extended hundreds of meters underground, branching and sub-branching, following the vein of gold wherever it led. Today, the main accessible tunnel has been made safe and is used for guided tours. You put on a hard hat and follow the guide into the mountain, and the rock closes around you, and the temperature drops, and the light disappears quickly behind you as you go deeper. In the deepest accessible section of the tour, you turn off the torches. The darkness in a mine tunnel, when all the lights are out, is total. There is no gradation, no soft darkness or medium darkness. There is simply the complete absence of light, a darkness that is physical rather than merely visual, that presses against the eyes with the same weight as the mountain presses against the walls of the tunnel. The guides leave the lights off for a minute or two, long enough to feel it. In the absolute dark of the long tunnel mine, it is very easy to think about the men who worked here, not in a dramatized, effortful way, but simply as a fact. Men were here, in this dark, for the working hours of every working day, for decades. They worked by candle and then by carbide lamp, small flames that pushed the darkness back only a few meters, and left everything beyond that margin in the same absolute black that you're standing in now. They were not particularly frightened of the dark because they had grown accustomed to it. Familiarity with darkness is one of the forms of adaptation that human beings can make, and the miners who worked in Walhalla for years became comfortable in underground spaces in a way that surface people generally are not. But they knew what they were doing. They knew the rock above them was enormous. They knew about roof falls and gas and flooding and the other hazards that underground mining generates. They wore their knowledge of these dangers the way they wore their work clothes, as a constant, ordinary part of the working day. The gold they extracted was shipped out of the valley and down to Melbourne and eventually became part of the great flows of money and material that were building colonial Australia. It built banks and institutions and homes and churches in Melbourne and Sydney and Adelaide. It funded the infrastructure of a colony that was becoming a nation. In the valley above the mine, in the terraced cemetery on the steep hillside, some of those miners are buried. At night in the valley, when the tourists have gone and the small current population of Walhalla has gone to sleep. And the creek is doing its quiet work through the dark, the cemetery holds its names in the darkness. The headstones are not illuminated. They stand in the dark like all headstones stand in all darknesses. But in the morning, when the light comes into the valley slowly, because the valley is narrow and the light has to find its way down the steep hillsides before it reaches the floor, the headstones emerge from the shadow and the names come back into legibility. And the fact of all those individual lives reasserts itself. This happens every morning. Has happened every morning since the last stone was set. Will happen every morning for a very long time to come. Returning to Silverton. The light at Silverton in the late afternoon is famous. Artists have been coming here for decades to paint it, and photographers have been chasing it. And people who know nothing about art or photography drive out from Broken Hill and stand on the edge of the plain and watch it happen, and find themselves unable to fully describe what they saw. It is not one color. It shifts and changes minute by minute as the sun descends, from the white glare of midday to the softening gold of mid-afternoon to the deep amber and burnt orange of the hour before sunset. And then the extraordinary brief period, sometimes only 5 or 10 minutes long, when the clouds catch the remaining light and the plains are lit in shades of pink and violet that seem excessive, too saturated, like something from a film. And then the dark comes, and it comes fast out here, because the horizon is so flat and the sky so enormous and there is nothing to hold the light. The artists who have come to Silverton have painted the pub and the ruins and the plain and the light, and their paintings are in galleries in Sydney and Melbourne, and in the collection of the Silverton Hotel itself, which has accumulated decades of work by people who came here and tried to capture what the place looks like. None of them have quite got it, or so the people who know Silverton will tell you. The paintings are true, but not complete. They capture the colours, but not the silence. They get the light, but not the weight of the air. The Silverton pub is one of the genuinely great outback pubs of Australia. This is a category that the country takes seriously. The walls of the front bar are covered in photographs and newspaper cuttings and memorabilia that record the history of the town and the country around it. And behind the bar, above the bottles, there are more images, more faces, more records of the people and the events and the decades that have made Silverton what it is. It is a museum that serves beer. It is a place where the past is present, not in the formal preserved way of an actual museum, but in the informal, organic way of a place that has simply accumulated its history and found no particular reason to throw any of it away. At closing time, when the last drinks are served and the bar empties and the lights go out, the pub is quiet in a way that is different from the daytime quiet. The memorabilia on the walls becomes something other than decoration. It becomes, in the dark, a presence. All those faces, all those events, all those decades. And outside, the plain stretches away in every direction under the stars, or enormous and flat and ancient, unchanged in its essential character by any of it. Returning to Kiandra, the snowgrass at Kiandra moves in waves when the wind comes across the high plains. It is a particular kind of grass, adapted to the cold and the snow, and the short growing season of the alpine environment, and it grows in tussocks that are dense at the base and feathery at the top. And in the wind they move with a rhythm that is almost hypnotic. A whole field of them swaying together, not in unison exactly, but in conversation. Each tussock responding to the wind slightly differently, creating a surface that is alive in the way that all grass is alive. But more visibly so here, more expressively, because the wind is stronger and the field is wider, and there is nothing to interrupt the view. The miners who camped at Kiandra in the winter of 1860 would have known this grass well. They would have camped on it and walked through it, and perhaps, on windy days, watched it move the way you are imagining it moving now. They would have been cold. The snowy mountains in winter are genuinely cold. Not cosmetically cold the way lower altitude places can be, but cold in a way that requires serious attention, that demands good clothing and shelter and fire. Some of them were very poorly equipped for the conditions. The rush to Kiandra happened so fast, driven by the news of gold, that many men arrived unprepared, in clothing suitable for the lowland summers they had left behind, into a winter mountain environment that killed people who were not careful. The Kiandra cemetery is on a slight rise above the old town site. In winter, the snow covers it completely, and the headstones disappear under the white, and the whole of the old Kiandra is simply a white expanse, undifferentiated, the variations in the land beneath the snow invisible. In spring, when the snow melts and the headstones emerge again, they are wet and clean, and the inscriptions are briefly sharpened by the moisture, the letters darker and more legible than they will be when the summer dries them out again. This happens every year. The snow comes, the stones disappear, the snow melts, the stones return. It has been happening for over 150 years. The Norwegians who skied on these slopes are, in a sense, still here. Their descendants, or rather the descendants of their invention, are in the resorts down the road. On the lifts and the groomed runs and the half-pipes and the gentle learner slopes where children learn, with various degrees of enthusiasm and terror, to stand on 2 pieces of plastic and go downhill. The principle has not changed. Stand on planks, go down, try not to fall. They did it in 1861. We do it now. The mountain is the same mountain. Returning to Ravenswood, the courthouse at Ravenswood heard cases for decades. It was built in 1878, and the building that was constructed was, by the standards of inland Queensland at the time, impressive. A stone building with a raised veranda and proper courtroom furniture and a holding cell attached and all the formal apparatus of the colonial justice system. The cases that came before it were the ordinary cases of a gold rush town: theft, assault, drunkenness, the various offences against property and person and public order that human communities generate wherever they exist. There were more serious cases too: claims disputes, cases involving the violence that goldfields bred, cases where the jury had to weigh evidence and testimony and make determinations about guilt and innocence. A magistrate who presided over the courthouse for a period in the 1880s rode out from Townsville on a regular circuit, covering several goldfield towns in succession, spending a day or two at each one hearing the accumulated cases. He recorded his impressions of Ravenswood in a letter to his wife that survives in the Queensland State Archives. And his description of the town is practical and slightly weary, the description of a man doing his job in difficult conditions. He mentions the heat, he mentions the dust. So he mentions that the hotel where he stayed had excellent mutton and indifferent beer. He does not mention that he was making history, because he was not, from his own perspective. He was just doing his job. The courthouse has been standing since 1878. It has survived the decline of the town and the cyclones that come off the Coral Sea, and the slow attrition of tropical weather. The walls are intact. The veranda still provides shade. The courtroom is empty of its furniture, of course. The benches and the dock and the witness stand all long gone. But the room is still recognizably a courtroom. The high windows that were placed to provide light without glare still light the empty space. There are no cases waiting to be heard, but it stands. In the Queensland heat, in the Golden Country, it stands. Returning to Cossack. The tides at Cossack are extraordinary. This is the northwest coast of Australia, and the tidal range here is among the largest in the world. The distance between low tide and high tide can be 8 or 9 metres, and on the big spring tides it can exceed 10. The water comes in fast and retreats fast, and the exposed mudflats and rock platforms at low tide are replaced within hours by metres of water. The pearling industry understood and worked around these tides. The luggers that went out to the pearl grounds had to navigate the tidal currents, which, in the shallow waters of the northwest coast, are powerful and complex. The divers who went over the side and sank to the bottom, their breath held, working with their hands in the dark to pry open oysters, were working in tidal waters that demanded knowledge and respect. They were mostly not European. The European pearling masters who owned the luggers did not, in general, do the diving. The diving was done by Aboriginal men in the earliest period, and later by Japanese and Malay and Filipino and Torres Strait Islander divers who were brought to the northwest coast under various arrangements that ranged from employment contracts to virtual slavery. The Japanese divers, particularly, were numerous and skilled. They came from pearl diving communities in southern Japan. Men who had grown up understanding the sea and the pressures of depth, who had refined techniques over generations for maximizing the time they could spend underwater on a single breath. They died in numbers that their communities at home would have found difficult to believe. The northwest coast was dangerous in ways that went beyond the ordinary dangers of diving. The cyclones came without adequate warning. The sharks were large and present. The bends, the decompression sickness that results from ascending too quickly from depth, was poorly understood and even more poorly managed. The Japanese graves in the Cossack cemetery are marked with granite stones brought from Japan, in some cases, or with concrete markers bearing Japanese characters. They record names and ages and the dates of death, and the dates cluster in the cyclone seasons and in the years when the industry was most active and most careless. These men came to the other side of the world to dive for pearls that they would never own, in waters they had never seen before, in a country whose language they did not speak. They are buried on a red hill above a silted harbour, within sound of the tides they worked in. At night, the lighthouse still flashes. It flashes because it was maintained, because someone decided it should continue, because the light that has always been there should keep being there even when the reason for it has dissolved. One flash, a pause, another flash. The water comes in and goes out. The rock platforms appear and disappear. The mangroves along the creek move in the tidal wind, and the lighthouse keeps its rhythm, patient and regular and indifferent to everything except the dark. Returning to Newnes, the glowworms do not know they are in ruins. This is worth remembering. The Arachnocampa richardsii, the New South Wales glowworm, is a small larva that produces light through a chemical process involving a compound called luciferin and an enzyme called luciferase, in a reaction that produces light with extraordinary efficiency. Nearly all of the energy consumed in the reaction is emitted as light, with very little waste heat, which is why the light can be sustained for the months that a larva spends in this stage of its life. The larva suspends itself from a horizontal surface and hangs dozens of sticky threads below it. Small insects, attracted by the light, fly into the threads and become stuck, and the larva reels them in and eats them. It is a beautiful and somewhat macabre arrangement. In the old retort tunnels of Newnes, the glowworms have colonized the damp brick surfaces with a thoroughness that suggests they find the environment entirely satisfactory. The chemistry of the old brickwork, altered by decades of the industrial processes that went on inside, has created conditions that suit them. The moisture levels are appropriate. The temperature is stable. When you enter the tunnel, your eyes adjust slowly, and as they do, the blue-green constellations of the glowworm threads become visible. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually as though the light is growing. First a few points of light, then more, then a ceiling that is populated with moving blue-green points. Some brighter, some dimmer, all of them engaged in the quiet business of existence. It is a strange experience to stand in a place built for industrial purposes, in the ruins of a shale oil operation from 1906, and be surrounded by bioluminescent insects going about their entirely natural lives. The contrast between the brick and the biology, between the industrial intent of the structure and the natural occupation of its abandoned interior, is the kind of thing that seems almost designed. But it wasn't designed, it simply happened. The mill closed, the workers left, the dark came into the tunnels and stayed. The glowworms moved in, generation after generation, each one completing its life cycle in the dark and leaving behind the conditions for the next one. For decades, in the tunnels of Newnes, the glowworms have been lighting up the dark for no audience at all, just doing what glowworms do in the damp brick dark of an old shale oil retort. The Walgan Valley outside is full of its own sounds and presences. The creek runs as it always does. The wallabies move through the restored bush in the evenings. The kookaburras are very loud in the mornings, as kookaburras always are. The sandstone cliffs rise above all of it, 250 million years old. In the dark of the valley night, the glowworms light their small tunnels. The light is very gentle. It is the gentlest light in Australia, perhaps. Quieter than starlight. More intimate than moonlight. Blue-green and soft and entirely without intention. It is just light. It will be light long after the tunnels eventually fall, long after the last brick has come down and the last piece of the retort works has returned to the earth, because the glowworms will simply move to wherever the next suitable surface is, and go on and light the dark, and catch their small insects, and continue their ancient and entirely uninterested existence. What the headstones say. Every cemetery in every town on this list tells a version of the same story, the version that is specific to that place, to those people, to those decades. But underneath the specificity, the same shape. People came from somewhere, lived somewhere, and ended somewhere. And someone who loved them or knew them, or simply felt the obligation of community, put a stone above them with a name and a date and sometimes a few words. The words on outback headstones are worth attending to. They are often very brief, because brevity was practical. The stone carvers who made them were doing documentary work, and the cost of carving was calculated by the letter, and the families who commissioned them were rarely wealthy, but sometimes the brevity becomes eloquence, sacred to the memory of. This was the standard formula. What were the three words that opened almost every 19th century headstone in the country? Sacred, meaning that this memory was not ordinary, not casual, not something you could set aside when you felt like it. Memory, not just recollection, but the ongoing responsibility of remembering, the active maintenance of the fact of a life in the minds of the living, of the possessive, which in this context means the memory belongs to the dead person. The memory is theirs, even though they are no longer present to own anything. Sacred to the memory of. Three words that say, this person was here, this person mattered. This person is not entirely gone as long as this stone stands and someone reads what it says. Beloved wife, beloved husband, beloved son, beloved daughter. The word beloved is interesting in headstone inscriptions because it is not a word that is used very often in ordinary speech. We say we love people. We rarely say we have beloved people. The past tense participial form implies something that was done over time, that was a state of being rather than a single act. That was the condition of the relationship from its beginning to its end. Beloved, they were loved thoroughly and continuously, and it is stated here, in stone for as long as the stone lasts, in God's care, at rest, in the arms of the Lord. The religious formulae of the 19th century were not empty. They were the genuine vocabulary of people who believed, or who found the language of belief to be the most adequate response to the inadequacy of any other language when it came to describing what happened when a person died. The headstones in the goldfield cemeteries carry these words in the handwriting of the stone carver, who was given a piece of paper with the details and translated them into stone with whatever skill and care they brought to the work. Some of the inscriptions are crooked, some of the letters are uneven, some of the O's are not quite round, and some of the S's lean more than they should. These are the marks of a person working with a chisel and a hammer on stone, doing their best under the particular conditions of their particular place and time. Those marks are still there, in the cemeteries of Farina and Gwalia and Silverton and Ravenswood and Cossack and all the others. The marks of those chisels are still in the stone, still legible in the right light. It is still recording the names and the dates and the words that someone decided were the right words to say. On the objects left behind, there is a subdiscipline of archaeology called assemblage analysis, which concerns itself not with the individual object, but with the collection of objects found together in a single place. The idea is that any individual object tells you something limited. A cup found alone tells you that someone in this place used cups, but a cup found alongside a kettle and a tin of tea and two chairs positioned either side of a small table tells you something much richer. That two people sat here regularly, in the morning or the evening, and drank tea together, and that this was a habitual, intimate thing. A ritual of daily life so ordinary that it required no planning, and left no record except the objects themselves. Gwalia is the purest example of assemblage analysis available in Australia outside of a formal archaeological context. Because the town was abandoned so suddenly, in a matter of weeks in late 1963, the objects were not curated or arranged or selected for posterity. They were simply left in the configurations of ordinary use, which means that the assemblages in the workers' cottages are genuine, unedited records of how those spaces were used in the ordinary course of a life. The kitchen of a Gwalia worker's cottage, documented before any conservation intervention disturbed it, contained a cast iron frying pan on the stovetop, its interior still black with the residue of decades of cooking. So was 3 mismatched mugs on hooks above the bench, 2 of them with brown rings inside from tannin staining accumulated over years. A tin canister labelled in a brand that ceased production in the 1950s, still containing a small amount of dry material that had once been tea. A calendar from 1962, the year before the closure, open to July. A child's drawing pinned to the wall beside the back door with a tack. The drawing executed in crayon on ruled exercise paper, depicting what might be a house and a tree and a figure that might be a person or might be anything. The child who drew that picture is alive somewhere today. They are not a child anymore. They have lived the decades since November 1963 in other places, other houses, other configurations of ordinary objects. They have almost certainly forgotten drawing it, or if they remember drawing it, they have no way of knowing it is still there, pinned to the wall of a cottage that they left when they were small, in a town that they left and could not go back to because the town became something else. The drawing is still there. This is the thing about the objects at Gwalia that becomes difficult to hold steadily in the mind. The ordinary detritus of ordinary life, the objects so mundane that they were not worth taking, has outlasted the life that produced them in the specific configuration of their use. The child's drawing on the kitchen wall is more present in that kitchen, at this moment, than the child who drew it, because the child has moved through 60 years of time and change and become someone almost entirely different, while the drawing has simply remained, fading slowly. The crayon colours paling toward the white of the paper beneath, pinned where it was pinned on a November morning in 1963. The frying pan knows nothing of this. It is a frying pan. It does not experience its own persistence, but we experience it on its behalf when we stand in that kitchen and look at what remains. We experience the strangeness of the object outlasting the life it served, the thing persisting after the person, the record surviving the event it recorded. This is what museums attempt to replicate in formal settings, the preservation of objects in something like their original context, the maintenance of the assemblage so that the relationship between objects can still be read. Gwalia does it without any museum intervention, simply by virtue of its isolation and its dry climate and the speed of its abandonment. It is an accidental museum of a very specific moment in very specific lives, and the accidental quality of it, the absence of curatorial intent, is precisely what makes it so powerful. The objects in a formal museum have been selected. Someone decided they were worth keeping. Someone decided they were representative or significant or beautiful or historically important. The decision to preserve them is already an interpretation, already a statement about what matters and what the past means. The objects in a Gwalia cottage have not been selected. They are there because they were not taken, which is a different and in some ways more honest form of survival. They represent not the judgment of posterity about what was worth keeping, but the judgment of a family in a hurry about what was worth the effort of packing. They are the residue of a calculation made under stress, and that residue is, in its own way, as revealing as any deliberate archive. The things people take when they leave in a hurry are the things they cannot imagine their lives without. The things they leave are the things they thought they could replace, or the things that were too heavy, or the things that were too broken, or the things that had somehow become invisible through overuse, so ordinary that they were no longer seen as things at all, just as furniture of the taken-for-granted world. The child's drawing was not taken, that too is a fact. Someone in that kitchen in November 1963. Perhaps there was simply no room. Perhaps it was genuinely forgotten in the chaos of a sudden departure. We will never know. But the drawing stayed, and the kitchen stayed, and the town stayed, and 60 years later it is still there, fading very slowly toward invisibility, preserving in its crayon marks the fact of a morning when a child sat at a kitchen table and drew a house and a tree and a figure that might be a person. That morning happened. It is one of the most certain things about Gwalia. On the particular silence of schools. Every ghost town that had a school has a particular quality that the towns without schools do not have. And it takes a moment to identify what it is. It is the silence of children. Not the presence of children, because there are no children. But the specific weight of the silence where children used to be, which is different from the silence of the empty hotel or the empty mine office or the empty store. Those silences are the silences of adult purposes, adult transactions, the absence of the purposeful busyness of economic life. They carry a kind of professional emptiness, the stillness of a workplace outside working hours. The silence of the school is something else. Children are, among all the human categories, the loudest and the most continuously present in their sound. A school in operation is one of the noisiest places in any community. The playground at recess, the singing that carries through closed windows, the bell that structures the day and carries its sound across the whole town. The sound of chalk on blackboards and feet on wooden floors and doors opening and closing, and the particular quality of 20 or 30 voices saying different things at the same time in a small enclosed space. When that is gone, the silence it leaves is complete in a way that the silence of other empty buildings is not. The school at Gwalia is gone. Only its site remains, a flat area on the edge of the town. The footing still visible if you know where to look. The outline of the building present in the slight difference between the ground inside the footings and the ground outside. The playground equipment, if there was any, is long gone. The fence is long gone. The bell, wherever it was, is long gone. But the flatness of the site and the way it is positioned in relation to the rest of the town still reads as school. The relationship between a school and the surrounding community is visible in the layout even when the school itself is absent. The way a missing tooth is visible in a jaw even though it is the absence and not the presence that you're seeing. The Ravenswood school is different. It still stands, at least in part, its stone walls maintaining their basic structure, its windows long since emptied of glass, the interior open to the weather and the birds that nest in the roof timbers. It is still recognizably a school. The dimensions of the room are the dimensions of a classroom. The orientation of the windows is the orientation that maximizes light on desks. The proportions of the building are the proportions of a building designed around the needs of 30 children and one teacher. Standing in the Ravenswood school in the late afternoon, when the light comes through the empty windows at the angle that was designed for desks long since removed, is one of the more affecting experiences available at any site on this list. The light falls on nothing. There are no desks, no slates, no exercise books, no small heads bent over their work. The dust moves in the light, the way dust always moves in afternoon light, slowly and in no particular direction, without purpose. Somewhere in the landscape around Ravenswood, almost certainly in a nursing home or a cemetery, is the last person who sat in that school as a student, who was taught in that room, who heard a teacher's voice in that specific acoustic space, with its specific echo and its specific quality of sound, unlike any other room in the world, because every room's acoustic is unlike every other room's acoustic. That person carries in their memory a sound that no longer exists in the world except in their memory. The sound of that room, occupied and alive. When they die, that sound will be entirely gone, not preserved anywhere, not recoverable by any means, simply absent from the universe from that day forward. This is what ghost towns mean at their most serious, not the ruins, not the aesthetic of abandonment, not the picturesque quality of stone walls and empty windows and pepper trees growing untended in the heat, the loss of the specific and unrepeatable sounds of specific lives in specific places, the sound of 30 children saying their times tables in the Ravenswood school on a Thursday morning in 1882. Gone, entirely and permanently gone. Not because it was not worth preserving, but because there was no way to preserve it and no one thought to try. This is the true content of the silence of these places, not emptiness, the accumulated absence of all the sounds that were made here and are not retrievable. Let that settle softly as your breathing slows and the room around you goes quiet. All those sounds, all those voices, all those Thursday mornings, gone, but having been. And having been is not nothing. Having been is, in the end, everything. On the subject of trees, there is a specific kind of ghost town melancholy associated with trees. Not the native trees, the eucalypts and acacias and wattles that were here before the towns, and returned to the cleared areas after the towns emptied. Those trees are doing what they have always done, and their presence in and around the ruins is entirely natural and expected, and in many ways beautiful. The sad trees, the ones that carry the particular weight of abandonment, are the introduced ones. The planted ones. The trees that someone put in the ground in front of their house or beside the gate of their property because they wanted shade or beauty or because the garden they had left somewhere else was in their mind and they were recreating it in a modest and partial way in a place very different from where they had started. A rose bush blooming in the ruins of an abandoned outback homestead is one of the more quietly devastating things you can encounter in the Australian countryside. Someone planted that rose. They chose it and planted it and watered it in a climate that was indifferent to roses and watched it grow. They cut flowers from it and put them in a vase on the kitchen table. And then they left. And the rose kept growing because roses are persistent in ways that domestic circumstances cannot always anticipate. And it bloomed every spring and dropped its petals in the heat and went thorny and leggy without anyone to prune it. And it is still doing this now, in the ruins, untended and magnificent in its refusal to stop. In Farina, there are pepper trees that were planted by residents in the 1880s and 1890s. The pepper tree is a South American species that was widely planted in Australian outback towns in the 19th century because it tolerates extreme heat and dry conditions and provides excellent shade. In Farina, The pepper trees planted by settlers who are now dead and gone and beyond memory have grown for 130 years and are now enormous. They're spreading canopies providing shade to ruins that no longer have roofs, their roots going deep into the red earth in search of whatever moisture exists down there. They were planted as practical things. They became, by outlasting everything else, something more. In Gwalia, the gardens of the workers' cottages contained plants that were chosen by people who had come from England and Scotland and Germany and other parts of Europe, and who planted what they knew. Some of those bulbs are still in the ground, still coming up every spring, still flowering in the yards of cottages whose walls are collapsing, in gardens whose fences have fallen, a daffodil in the dust of the goldfields. It is a very small thing. It is, in some ways, the most heartbreaking thing of all. But there is another category of tree in the ghost towns that is worth considering, and it is the trees that were not planted for beauty or shade or the comfort of a remembered home. They are the trees that were planted for food. Fruit trees. In the gardens of Yerranderie, in the sheltered mountain air that is cold enough to satisfy the chill requirements of stone fruits and apples and pears, there are fruit trees that have been growing untended for 80 years. The families who planted them with the practical intention of feeding themselves and their children, of reducing the cost and difficulty of bringing food into a remote mountain community, of establishing a small measure of self-sufficiency in a place where every imported item represented a difficult and expensive journey. The trees bear fruit. Every year they flower in spring, and the bees that live in the surrounding forest find the flowers and the fruit sets, and by autumn there are apples and pears on branches that have not been pruned in living memory, in shapes that a professional orchardist would find horrifying, sprawling and unpredictable and crossed and tangled in ways that reduce yield and invite disease. But the fruit is real, it is edible. It falls to the ground in autumn and feeds the wallabies and the wombats and the various birds that have learned where the untended orchard is, and what time of year the fruit comes down. The family that planted those trees is gone. Their children are gone. The generations between then and now have moved through their lives in other places, and none of them have been back to harvest what their great-grandparents planted. But the trees do not know this. They simply grow, as trees grow, toward light and water, fruiting when the season calls for it. Dropping what is not taken, beginning again the following spring with the same patient indifference to everything that is not light, water, and soil. There is an apple tree in the ruins of a homestead outside Silverton, on a property that was abandoned in the 1930s, when the last of the pastoral families gave up on the dry country west of Broken Hill. The homestead is almost entirely gone, only its stone chimney still standing to any significant height. But the apple tree is still there, planted perhaps in the 1890s or early 1900s. Its trunk now thick and gnarled and considerably larger than any garden apple tree is supposed to become, because no one has ever thinned it or shaped it or done any of the things that orchard management requires. In a good year, when the rain has been sufficient, it produces apples. Not many, not reliably. But some years, in the late summer heat of the Barrier Ranges, small hard green apples hang from the unpruned branches of a tree planted by someone whose name is not recorded, in a garden that no longer exists, beside a house that is now a chimney. The crows find them before anything else does, and then the other birds, and then, at night, whatever is moving through the dry scrub in the dark, following its nose toward the smell of something sweet and ripe and entirely unexpected in the hot red country west of Broken Hill. Gad, on the post offices and the letters that passed through them. Every town on this list had a post office. This is not a coincidence or a bureaucratic detail. The post office was, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the institution that connected a remote community to the world beyond its horizon. Without a post office, a settlement was not quite real in the eyes of the colonial administration. With one, it had an address, a registration in the official geography of the colony, a designated place in the network of communication that held the country together. The post offices in these towns were often small, a single room in a building that might also serve as a residence for the postmaster or postmistress, a counter behind which the mail was sorted into individual pigeonholes, a set of scales for weighing parcels, a stamp pad and an ink pad, and the official date stamp that made every piece of correspondence official and located and real. The mail came on horseback in the early years, then by coach, then by the railways that eventually connected most of these towns to the wider network. The arrival of the mail was an event. In communities where the nearest large town might be 100 or 200 kilometers away, where the only news of the outside world came through the newspapers and letters that arrived in the mailbag, the delivery day had a significance that is difficult to fully appreciate from the perspective of a world in which news is instantaneous and communication is continuous. People wrote letters, not because they were literary, not because they had the leisure or the education to compose extended correspondence, but because letter writing was the only way to maintain a relationship across distance. The drover's wife in Farina, whose husband was on the road for months at a time, wrote letters and received them, and those letters were the substance of her connection to him during the long absences. The miner in Walhalla, who had come from Cornwall, wrote home to his mother, monthly if he could afford the postage. describing the valley and the mine and the strange Antipodean seasons, trying to make real for someone on the other side of the world a life that she would never see. The letters that pass through the post offices of these towns are, in many cases, still findable. They are in the state records offices and the National Archives and the various collections that individuals and families have maintained. They are in the personal papers of the people who wrote them and the people who received them, fragile and browning, and sometimes difficult to read as the ink fades to grey. They are evidence of the specific texture of lives lived in these specific places, more personal and more immediate than any official record. In the Batty Library in Perth, there is a collection of letters written by a woman who lived in Cossack in the 1890s. She wrote to her sister in Adelaide every few weeks for most of a decade. The letters describe the heat and the tides and the pearling season, and the particular quality of the northwest sky and the characters of her neighbours, and the small events of daily life in a port town at the edge of the continent. They also describe, in the final years of the correspondence, the beginning of the decline. The letters from 1900 onwards have a different quality from the earlier ones. The news is less varied. The neighbours mentioned in earlier letters are absent from the later ones. The harbour, which appears frequently in the early correspondence as a lively and active place, is described in the later letters as quieter, the boats fewer, the waterfront less busy. She does not describe a ghost town in the making because she does not know that is what she is describing. She describes her town, her home, her ordinary life, which is becoming incrementally less ordinary in ways that she attributes to the season or the economy or the specific circumstances of individual departures, rather than to the systemic decline of a place that is losing its reason for being. This is how ghost towns happen from the inside. Not as a dramatic event, but as a series of ordinary changes, each one explicable on its own terms, that accumulate over years into an irreversible drift toward emptiness. The post office at Cossack closed when the last postmaster left. The stamp pad dried out. The date stamp, which had marked every letter with the name and date of origin, was left on the counter or taken as a souvenir or lost in the ordinary chaos of an ending. The pigeonholes that had held the letters for each resident, labelled with names that are now on the headstones in the cemetery, were left empty. No letters arrive in Cossack anymore. There is no one to receive them. On the particular quality of rain in abandoned places. Rain falls differently on a ghost town. This is not a poetic exaggeration. It is a physical fact with a specific explanation, and the explanation reveals something about the relationship between human habitation and the built environment that is easy to overlook when the habitation is ongoing. When a building is occupied, it is maintained. Gutters are cleared of leaves before they can block an overflow. Downpipes are inspected and repaired when they crack. The roofing iron is tightened when it lifts at the edges in a storm. The timber framing is treated against rot and checked for damage after heavy rain. This maintenance is so ordinary, so much a part of the background activity of living in a building, that it is invisible until it stops. When the maintenance stops, when the building's abandoned, and the ordinary cycle of inspection and repair comes to an end. The rain begins to work on the building in ways that were always possible, but were always forestalled. The gutter fills with leaves, and then with soil, and then with the seeds that the wind brings. And a small ecosystem establishes itself in the gutter that was never a gutter garden when someone was climbing a ladder twice a year to clean it out. The blocked gutter overflows, and the overflow runs down the outside of the wall instead of through the downpipe, and the wall begins to absorb moisture in ways it was not designed to absorb. And the timber behind the wall cladding begins to soften in the places where the moisture collects. The roofing iron, no longer tightened when it lifts further in the next storm, and then further again, and eventually a section of it peels back, and the rain has direct access to the interior. And the interior begins to change. Floors absorb moisture and swell and then dry and contract and then swell again, season after season, until the joints begin to fail and the boards begin to lift from the joists below them. Plaster walls develop damp patches that grow and spread and eventually fail, the plaster separating from the timber lath beneath and falling in sections to the floor. In a climate like the northwest of Western Australia, where Cossack sits, the process is complicated by the intensity of the wet season. When the cyclones come and the rainfall can be measured in hundreds of millimeters in a single event. A building that has lost sections of its roof to previous storms encounters a cyclone not as a building, but as a frame, and the water that enters is not measured in drips, but in floods. And the damage it does in a single event can undo decades of relatively stable deterioration. The stone buildings resist this better than the timber ones, which is why the stone towns, Farina and Cossack, and the stone sections of Ravenswood retain their structures longer than the predominantly timber towns like Gwalia. Stone walls do not absorb moisture in the same way timber does. They weather rather than rot, their surfaces pitting and staining, but their structural integrity maintained far longer than any organic material. But even stone fails eventually, when the mortar between the courses washes out and the courses begin to shift relative to each other, and the wall that has stood plumb for 100 years develops a lean, and the lean increases with each season of rain and freeze and thaw until the wall falls. In the mountains around Walhalla and Yerranderie, the freeze-thaw cycle is a significant factor. Water that has infiltrated the mortar or the pores of the stone expands when it freezes, exerting pressure on the material around it, and then contracts when it thaws, leaving a slightly larger void than before. Season after season, this process opens the stone, widening cracks and separating courses, and eventually, over the span of decades, dismantling walls that were built to last generations. What this means, practically, is that every abandoned building in every ghost town in Australia is in the process of becoming something that is not a building. The process is slow, in most cases, measured in decades or centuries rather than years, but it is continuous and it is irreversible. And the buildings that exist now are not the buildings that will exist in 50 years, or 100 or 500. The rain is patient in the way that all erosive forces are patient. It does not hurry. It does not need to. It falls and falls and falls, season after season, on the rooftops and the walls and the headstones and the pepper trees and the red earth. And it does its quiet work, and the buildings become ruins, and the ruins become rubble, and the rubble becomes soil, and the country reclaims what was always going to be reclaimed. In the meantime, the rain sounds different in an abandoned building than it does in an occupied one. In an occupied building, rain on a corrugated iron roof is the sound of shelter. It is the sound of being inside, of the boundary between wet and dry, between exposed and protected. It is, for many Australians, one of the most comforting sounds in the natural world, rain on an iron roof, because it means the roof is there and you are under it, and the rain is outside rather than inside. In an abandoned building, rain on whatever remains of the roof is the sound of intrusion. The gaps in the iron allow the rain to enter. The roof is no longer a membrane between inside and outside, but a partial obstruction, a thing that deflects some of the water, but not all of it. And the water that enters falls on the swollen floorboards and the fallen plaster, and the objects that were left behind and have already been exposed to many previous seasons of rain. The sound is the same sound, the meaning is entirely different. And somewhere in the difference between those two meanings is the whole story of what it means for a place to be inhabited and then not. Distance. All of the places on this list are remote, not all of them in the same way. Silverton is accessible by a sealed road from Broken Hill, and Walhalla is reachable in a day from Melbourne, and Yerranderie is close to Sydney by Australian standards. But all of them require effort to reach, require a decision to go there, require enough commitment that casual visitors are relatively few. This remoteness has protected them in various ways. It has prevented the kind of commercial development that would have turned them into theme parks or shopping precincts or subdivisions. It has kept the vandalism and theft that devastate more accessible abandoned places to a manageable level. It has meant that the silence has been largely preserved, but the remoteness has also meant that the towns have been allowed to decay without much intervention, and the buildings that were not stone have largely gone, and the records are patchy, and the oral histories have been lost as the people who held them have died. This is the cost of the protection. The ghost towns of Australia are, in a sense, testing the patience of everyone who cares about them. They are far away. They are hot or cold or dry or wet in ways that are uncomfortable. They require time and effort and a willingness to be in places where the nearest assistance is a long way away. But the reward for that patience is access to something that is becoming increasingly rare. Silence, real silence, not the absence of traffic noise, but the presence of something that existed before human noise was possible. The silence of land and air and water doing what they do without reference to human activity, and the particular silence of places that were once loud and are now quiet. The silence of a finished story, which is not the silence of nothing. It is the silence of everything that happened and is now over. The silence of the past, present, and the present, the silence of stone and soil and the names cut into headstones, all of it held in the still air under the enormous Australian sky. It is, if you let it, a very restful silence. The towns are patient, the night is long. The stars above Farina are moving very slowly in their ancient and indifferent patterns. And you can sleep now. You can really, truly sleep. Why? The long patience of stone. There is a reason that every human culture, across every period of recorded history, has built with stone when stone was available and the intention was permanence. It is not only that stone is strong, although it is. It is not only that stone resists fire and rot and the other forces that destroy organic materials, although it does. It is that stone carries a quality that organic materials do not carry in the same way, the quality of geological time. When you touch a sandstone wall in Cossack, or a granite block in the Walhalla cemetery, or the vault of the Farina bakery underground, you are touching something that was formed under conditions that predate human existence on this continent by tens of millions of years. The sandstone of the Blue Mountains around Yerranderie was deposited in the Triassic period, 250 million years ago, when the landmass that would eventually become Australia was part of the supercontinent Gondwana, and the ancestors of the eucalypts and the marsupials had not yet begun their long evolutionary journeys. The stone in the walls of these buildings was cut from that deep time and shaped by human hands and set in the configurations that human purposes required, and it has been holding those configurations ever since, and it will go on holding them long after all the purposes are forgotten and the hands that shaped it are dust. This is not a melancholy thought, it is a grounding one. The stone connects you to something older than the particular story of any of these towns. Older than the gold rushes and the pearling fleets and the shale oil works and the asbestos mines. Older than the colonial project that brought all of these things into being. Older than the continent's current configuration in the Southern Ocean. Older than almost anything that human minds find easy to contemplate. The stone was here before us. It will be here after us. And in the time between, it held our walls and our graves and our bakeries and our courthouses. And it asked nothing for the service except to be acknowledged as what it is, the most patient material in the world. When you're lying in the quiet dark, in the house that is yours, in the town or city or suburb that is yours, and the night is doing its slow work of softening and releasing, you might think about the stone in the walls of these places. In not the places themselves necessarily, not the specific histories which are now stored somewhere in your mind for later retrieval or later forgetting, just the stone, the quality of it, the patience of it, the way it absorbs the heat of the day and releases it slowly through the night, the way it holds water in its pores and gives it back to the air over days and weeks, the way it records in its surface every century of weather, and every hand that has touched it and every moment of every day that has passed while it was standing, the way it endures. That quality is available to you now as the night deepens and the sounds of the house settle and your breathing slows and the dreams begin to build themselves at the edges of consciousness. You can borrow something of that patience. You can allow yourself to be held by it. The way the ruins of Farina are held by their stone. The way the Walhalla cemetery is held by the mountains around it. The way the glowworm tunnels of Newnes are held by the sandstone cliffs. Held quietly in the dark for as long as necessary. The hours between dark and light. There is a kind of knowledge that only comes from staying somewhere until morning. Not the daylight knowledge, the knowledge of what things look like and where they are and how to navigate from one to another. That knowledge is available to anyone who visits. You can acquire it in an afternoon and leave with it, and it will be accurate and useful and entirely sufficient for most purposes. The other knowledge, the knowledge that comes from the hours between midnight and dawn, is different. It is not easily articulated. It is not the kind of knowledge that fits neatly into sentences or that can be communicated in photographs or described in maps. It is the knowledge of how a place sounds when it is most itself. When the last tourist has gone and the last caretaker has closed their door and the day's activity has settled and the place is doing what it does when it is not being observed. In Farina, the deep night sound is wind. The country around Farina is flat enough that the wind moves across it with nothing to break or redirect it, and it comes through the empty doorways of the stone ruins with a consistency that is almost rhythmic, not melodic, not the kind of wind that whistles through cracks, but a broad, low, continuous movement of air that fills the spaces between the walls and passes on. In Gwalia, the deep night is quieter than Farina, because the country is less open and the ruins are more sheltered. But it is not entirely silent. The corrugated iron of the remaining sheds and buildings contracts as the temperature falls, producing small metallic sounds, ticks and pops that emerge from the darkness at irregular intervals. Each one is small and unremarkable. Together, over the course of a long night, they constitute a kind of language that no one has learned to interpret. In Wittenoom, the deep night is complicated by the wind through the gorge, which is channeled by the rock walls and moves faster and more purposefully than open country wind. The sound it makes in the empty buildings of the town site is different from wind in an open plain. It is more directed, more specific, with particular notes generated by particular apertures and edges. In Yerranderie, the deep night brings the mountain cold, and with it a stillness that is different from desert stillness. The forest around the town absorbs and moderates the wind, so the nights here are often very quiet, with only occasional sounds, the crack of a branch cooling, the distant call of a nocturnal bird, the sound of the mountain breathing. In Walhalla, the creek is always present. Through every hour of the night, at every volume depending on the season and the rainfall, the creek runs through the narrow valley with a persistence that is the fundamental sound of the place, the sound against which all other sounds are measured. In Silverton, the night wind across the plain is company of a kind. It comes from a great distance, and it goes to a great distance, and it passes through the small collection of buildings and ruins with the easy authority of something that was here long before the buildings were, and will be here long after they have fallen. In Kiandra, the night in summer is cold, always, even in January and February when the rest of Australia is sweltering. The cold is clean and dry, and the stars through the cold dry air are very sharp, and the only sounds are the wind through the snowgrass and the occasional distant call of something moving through the alpine vegetation. In Ravenswood, the tropical night is loud with insects. The dry savanna around the town supports populations of insects that know nothing about gold or silver or the economics of mining, and their nighttime chorus is dense and layered, a constant background against which the silence of the abandoned buildings is paradoxically more audible. In Cossack, the tide is always present as a sound, even when it is not visible. The movement of water over rock and mud and the mangrove roots along the creek makes sounds that carry surprisingly far in the still night air, and combined with the flash of the lighthouse, the deep night at Cossack is one of the most atmospheric on this list. In Newnes, the valley contains its own ecology of night sounds, the wallabies and the possums and the birds that are active in the dark, the creek that runs through the valley floor, the wind that sometimes comes down off the plateau in the small hours and moves the treetops. And underneath all of it, from the direction of the old retort tunnels, nothing. The glowworms make no sound at all. Yet, what the morning brings. Dawn comes differently in each of these places, and that too is worth recording before the night finally ends and the sky begins to change. In Farina, the first light is horizontal. The land is so flat that the sun, when it finally crests the distant rim of the earth, throws its light directly across the surface of the landscape without the interruption of hills or trees. The stone walls of the ruins catch it immediately and glow amber and then orange, and then, as the sun rises, a warm gold that makes them look for about 20 minutes, as though they are lit from within. This is the best light for reading the headstones in the Farina cemetery. The low angle sharpens the shadows in the carved letters, making names legible that are invisible at midday. The cemetery volunteer who comes to Farina in the autumn has learned this, and does the most delicate identification work in the early morning, kneeling in the red dust with the light coming in low and warm over her shoulder, reading names that the sun only reveals at this one angle, at this one time of day. In Gwalia, the morning comes more gradually because the vegetation, sparse as it is, breaks the flatness of the goldfields landscape and creates a slightly more complex light. The first thing visible in Gwalia as the sky lightens is the silhouette of the Hoover house on its low hill, the straight edges of its corrugated iron roof against the paling sky, the dark rectangle of it holding its shape in the early dark before the color returns. And then the color comes back, the red of the dirt. The grey-green of the mulga and the blue bush, the faded white and cream of the weatherboard cottages, the rust of the corrugated iron. Gwalia gets its colour back every morning, the same colours it has had for 120 years. In Walhalla, the dawn is slow because the valley is narrow, and the sun has to climb above the eastern ridge before it can reach the valley floor. There is a long period, sometimes an hour or more, when the sky above is bright and blue and the light on the high ridge tops is gold and warm. But the valley itself is still in shadow, still in the cool grey of pre-dawn, the creek sounding different in the cold air, the headstones in the cemetery still dark. And then the sun clears the ridge and the valley fills with light from above, and the mist that has collected in the lowest part burns off quickly. And the birds, which have been building their chorus for the past half hour, reach the full volume of morning. In Newnes, the sandstone cliffs catch the morning sun in a way that is breathtaking even to people who have seen it many times. The cliff faces turn from grey to pink to gold to deep amber in the first half hour after sunrise. The layered sandstone lit differently in each layer, the horizontal banding of the stone made vivid by the angle of the light. And somewhere in the old retort tunnels, the glowworms are dimming their lights as the morning brightness reaches even the tunnels through the gaps in the old brickwork. They are not extinguished entirely during the day, but the contrast that makes them visible in the dark diminishes as the light grows, and they become, in daylight, invisible. They are there, though, waiting. They are always there. On the people who stayed. Most of the stories of ghost towns are stories of leaving. That is natural. The leaving is what made them ghost towns, and the leaving is what the silence is made of, and the leaving is the event that everything else follows from. You cannot have the ruins without the abandonment, and you cannot have the abandonment without the departure, and so the departure becomes the story. But there were people who stayed, not many in most cases. Not enough to keep a town alive in any conventional sense. But in nearly every place on this list, there were 1 or 2 or 3 people who, when the reasons for staying had dissolved and the logic had failed, and everyone else was loading their belongings into cars or trucks or whatever transport they had, simply did not go. But some of them could not go. They were too old or too sick or too poor or too entangled in the place to be able to disentangle. The particular kind of attachment that develops between a person and a place over decades is not always a thing that can be voluntarily released. You do not simply decide after 40 years that a place no longer has a claim on you. Sometimes the claim is too old and too deep and too thoroughly woven into everything you know about yourself to be lifted by a practical calculation about economics or safety or the future. Some of them would not go. This is a different category, and it deserves its own recognition. The woman in Wittenoom who stayed after the degazettement, after the utilities were cut, after the roads were officially closed, and the government had declared the place uninhabitable. She stayed because it was her home. Not her house, not a building she happened to occupy, but her home in the full sense, the place where her life had happened, where the specific texture of her days had been formed, where everything that was ordinary to her was ordinary there and nowhere else. The government's definition of uninhabitable did not match her definition of home, and she chose her definition. There is something in this that is worth sitting with, and not only because of its sadness. The people who stayed in the ghost towns were, in most cases, people who had a relationship to place, that the mobile, the economically rational, the prudent, could not quite understand from the outside. They were people for whom the question of where to live was not primarily an economical practical question, but an ontological one. A question about who they were, which was inseparable from where they were, which meant that leaving was not a practical adjustment, but a kind of self-erasure. We do not have good language for this in contemporary life, because contemporary life is organized around mobility, and the assumption that place is instrumental, a means to the ends of employment or lifestyle or family proximity, rather than constitutive of the self in the way it was for people who had been in one place for 30 or 40 years. The people who stayed in the ghost towns spoke a different language about place, and most of them have not left much of a record, because the people who stayed were not the people who gave interviews to newspapers or wrote memoirs or showed up in the official documentation. They were the people who were not worth documenting until there was no one left to document. Lorraine Thomas left Wittenoom in 2007. She was the last person to leave. There is a brief record of her departure, a few newspaper articles, a photograph or two. She is described as having been there for many years, as having refused the government's inducements to leave earlier, as having maintained a small business serving the tourists who came to see the gorges. She left because, in the end, staying had become too difficult. Not because of the asbestos, apparently, because of the isolation and the age and the simple difficulty of being the last person in a place that had been built for thousands. What she took with her when she left is not recorded. What she left behind, apart from the buildings and the streets and the contaminated soil, is also not recorded. She simply left, the way the others had left decades before her, the way people always leave when staying becomes finally impossible, and the town became what it had been becoming since 1966. Empty. The last person to leave is always the one who stays the longest, which seems obvious but is worth saying because it changes the nature of what their departure means. They are not the last of many, they are the last of one. The town ends with them, specifically, in a specific moment, on a specific day, when they closed whatever door they closed and drove or walked away. There is no record of what the town looked like in that moment, from the perspective of the person leaving it, what the empty streets looked like in the rearview mirror as they pulled away, whether they looked back at all. These are the things that ghost town history does not record, because history records events and facts and dates, not the quality of a specific feeling in a specific body on a specific afternoon. But the feeling was there, it happened, someone felt it, and the towns hold that too, along with everything else. The departure of the last person, in every one of these places, is present in the silence the same way the original settlement is present, invisible but not absent, part of the texture of what the place has become. On animals and returning nature. The animals come back. This is one of the things that nobody tells you about ghost towns, or not often enough, and it is one of the more quietly astonishing aspects of what happens when people leave a place that has been inhabited for decades or generations. The animals come back because the people have gone and the animals can. At Newnes, the wallabies and wombats and echidnas that the industrial activity had pushed to the margins of the valley returned to the center of it as soon as the workers left in 1932. The cleared areas, which had been held in their cleared state by the regular activity of hundreds of people and the machinery of an industrial operation, began immediately to revert to bush. Within a decade, the cleared ground was covered with young eucalypts and wattles. Within 2 decades, it was difficult to tell where the cleared areas had been. Within a century, the valley is so thoroughly revegetated that the industrial past is perceptible only in the ruins and the old railway cutting and the glowworm tunnels. The animals do not know about the industrial past. They do not know that the valley was once full of noise and smoke and the particular smells of shale oil processing. They know only that the valley is now, by their standards, suitable habitat, and they have occupied it with the thoroughness that nature always brings to available habitat. At Walhalla, the steep hillsides that were logged bare during the gold rush decades have grown back into dense mountain ash forest, one of the tallest flowering forests in the world, with trees that now reach 50 and 60 and in some places 70 meters in height. The forest that the miners stripped for timber and fuel has become, in 100 years of undisturbed regrowth, extraordinary. The lyrebirds that live in it, one of the most remarkable birds in Australia for the complexity and accuracy of their mimicry, are common in the Walhalla Valley now, moving through the undergrowth and calling from the ridges in the early morning with a song that incorporates every sound they have ever heard in that valley, which includes, according to the oral record, the sounds of the gold rush itself. Lyrebirds can live for 20 to 25 years in the wild, and they learn their songs from older birds, passing them down through generations, and there are ornithologists who believe that some of the sounds that Walhalla lyrebirds incorporate into their songs are very old mimicries indeed, sounds that originated in the calls of birds who heard the sounds of the gold rush and incorporated them into their singing, passing them down through so many generations of imitation that the origin is now untraceable. If this is true, and the evidence is circumstantial but not negligible, then the Walhalla lyrebirds are carrying in their songs a fragment of the sound of the gold rush, transformed through 150 years of avian mimicry into something unrecognizable as its origin but present nonetheless, the acoustic equivalent of a genetic memory. The creek at Walhalla runs cleaner than it did during the mining years, when the tailings and the mercury used in gold processing contaminated the water and the valley floor. A century of flushing by the clean water from the mountain catchments has reduced the contamination to levels that support the aquatic life the creek now carries. Platypus, galaxid fish, mountain shrimp, the various invertebrates that clean mountain streams support. At Cossack, the mangroves that were cut back during the port's active years to make room for the wharves and the working waterfront have recolonized the creek banks and the tidal edges. They are not large mangroves because the environment is harsh and the growth is slow, but they are there and they are spreading. And in another 50 years, they will have reclaimed more of what was taken from them during the pearling era. The birds at Cossack are extraordinary. The northwest coast of Western Australia is on one of the major flyways for migratory shorebirds. Birds that fly from breeding grounds in the northern hemisphere down to the Australian coast and back each year. A round trip of some 40,000 kilometres. The mudflats around Cossack, exposed at low tide, are feeding grounds for tens of thousands of these birds during the Australian summer, a resource they have been using long before the town was built and will continue using long after its ruins have returned to the earth. When the pearl loggers were working out of Cossack, the crews would have seen these birds every day, would have seen them descend on the mudflats at low tide, would have heard the particular noise a large flock of small wading birds makes when it takes flight suddenly, the rush and whistle of it, the way the flock shapes itself in the air like a single organism responding to a shared impulse. The birds did not stop coming when the town emptied. They do not know the town is empty. They know only the mudflats and the tides and the season and the 40,000 kilometres of ocean they have crossed to get here. At Farina, the kangaroos and emus and the various smaller marsupials of the outback move through the ruins at night with a freedom that they did not have when the town was occupied. The stone ruins provide shade that the animals use during the hottest parts of the day. The underground bakery, if the ventilation gaps allow them access, is used by various small creatures as shelter. The cemetery, with its relatively undisturbed ground, supports populations of small reptiles that bask on the headstones in the morning sun. The town has become, over 60 years of non-occupation, a kind of wildlife refuge, not formally, not by any human decision, but simply because the structures remain and the animals have found uses for them that their builders never anticipated. There is something about this that is both unsettling and beautiful. The ruins of human ambition, sheltering the creatures that were here before the ambition arrived and will be here after its physical traces have finally crumbled. The stone walls of the Farina Hotel, built with the confident expectation of a future that did not come, now providing shade for a mob of kangaroos in the heat of the afternoon. The builders are gone, the kangaroos are there. This is not a judgment. It is simply what happens when people leave and time continues. A final word before morning. Before the light comes fully, there is one more place. Not on any official list of ghost towns, not in any heritage register, not photographed by documentary makers or visited by tourists on heritage trails. It exists only in a record held in the State Library of South Australia, a ledger from the 1890s that catalogues the names of pastoral leases in the far outback, and in a note in the margin of that ledger, written in pencil by someone whose name is not recorded, that reads, "Settlement ceased. People gone. That is all. No town name, no reason given. Just those 5 words, settlement ceased. People gone. There was a settlement, there were people, and then there were not." This is the version of the ghost town story that has no walls, no cemetery, no pepper trees, no hotel register with a last entry. This is the version where even the record is nearly nothing. A pencil note in a margin, the minimum acknowledgement that something was here and is not here anymore. How many of these are there? How many places that were briefly inhabited, briefly named, briefly full of the noise and mess and effort of human life, that left no trace beyond a note in a margin or a water stain on old paper, or a slight depression in the red earth where a building once stood? Hundreds, probably, possibly thousands, across the vast interior. Settlements that were tried and failed, camps that became small communities and then were left, places that had names for a season and then the names were forgotten because everyone who knew them was gone or dead. They are in the ground, literally. The traces of them are in the soil, the small deposits of organic material where the kitchen waste was buried, the slightly different mineral composition of the earth where the walls stood, the changed microbiology of soil that has been disturbed by human occupation and then returned to the natural order. Archaeologists can find these traces if they look in the right places with the right tools. The country holds them long after the last visual evidence has gone. This is the deepest ghost town, the one that is only in the earth. Thinking about it in the last quiet before the dawn is a particular kind of meditation. All of these places, all of these lives, the immense, continuous, mostly unrecorded fact of people living in places and then leaving them or dying in them or both. And the places receiving all of this, the stone and the soil and the water and the air, receiving the lives that were lived in them, and then, when the lives ended, returning to what they were before, slowly and without comment. The land does not remember us the way we remember ourselves. It holds the chemical traces and the physical marks. But it does not hold the stories, the faces, the voices, the particular weight of a specific person in a specific place at a specific time. We hold those while we are here. And when we are gone, the stone will stand, and the wind will move through the empty doorways, and the creek will run, and the stars will turn in their ancient patterns, and the glowworms will light the dark. And that is enough. That is everything. Sleep now. Let the ghost towns hold their silence. Let the night do what nights do. Let the morning come when it comes, slow and golden over the red plains, warming the stone walls that have stood through 150 winters, finding the headstones in the cemetery and making the names legible again in the slanted early light. The names are still there. They will be there in the morning. They will be there long after the morning. Think about that for a moment, here in the quiet. The headstone cutters who chiseled those names into stone were not thinking about the 22nd century. They were not thinking about the people who would stand in those cemeteries 150 years hence, reading what they had written. They were thinking about the grief of a specific family in a specific year, and they were doing their job, cutting letters into stone so that the name would hold. And the name held. It is holding right now. In the cemetery at Farina under the outback stars, in the terraced rows at Walhalla, in the red-earthed ground at Cossack, the names are holding. They did not know they were making something for the ages. They were making something for a family. That it lasted this long is an accident of material. That we are still reading it is a choice. Good night from all 10 towns. Good night from the stones of Farina, still warm from yesterday's sun. Good night from the empty rooms of Gwalia, where the photographs have faded to the colour of old paper. Good night from the gorge walls of Wittenoom, striped in red and black and grey. Good night from the church bell at Yerranderie, tilted in its frame, waiting for a rope that will not come. Good night from the creek at Walhalla, doing its patient work in the narrow valley. Good night from the plain at Silverton, stretching to all horizons under the stars. Good night from the snowgrass at Kiandra, still, tonight, under the mountain dark. Good night from the courthouse at Ravenswood, holding its century and a half of silence. Good night from the lighthouse at Cossack, still turning, still faithful, still sending its light across the empty water. And good night from the glowworm tunnels of Newnes, where the light is always on, quiet and blue-green and entirely without need of an audience, in the brick dark of a mill that closed before your grandparents were born. Good night. The stone is standing, the water is running, the light is on, sleep. And if you come back tomorrow night, the towns will still be there, patient as stone, waiting in the dark the way they have always waited, the way they always will.